Hi, Guy. Tonight we're going somewhere quiet together, a place where the noise of the day fades and only stories remain. What you're about to hear isn't a history lesson, it's something softer than that. Something meant for the space between waking and sleep, where wonder lives and questions don't need immediate answers. Tonight we follow the path of a dreamer. A boy who started in a basement with glass jars and copper wire, speaking to forces no one else could see. A man who refused to let darkness have the final word. His name you'll know. But knowing a name isn't the same as knowing a story, and his story is written in 1,000 quiet failures, in midnight workshops, in the patient belief that light was waiting somewhere in the shadow if only he kept searching. So settle in, let your breath slow, let the world outside this moment fade to nothing. We have 12 chapters ahead, 12 meditations on mystery and persistence, on the sacred work of turning impossible into inevitable. Each one unfolds like candlelight in a dark room, slow, warm, gentle. We begin in a cellar, a boy, and lightning waiting to be tamed. Close your eyes if you want. The story will find you either way. Let's begin. It is said that beneath the floorboards of a modest Michigan home, in a cellar where sunlight arrived only as rumor through narrow windows, a boy discovered the grammar of invisible things. This was not the discovery of a moment, but the slow accumulation of communion, a child speaking to forces that had no name yet, that hummed beneath the surface of the ordinary world, waiting for someone curious enough to listen. The year moved between 1855 and the early silence of the 1860s. Above, the house settled into its evening rhythms, the clatter of supper dishes, the creak of rocking chairs, footsteps crossing worn pine floors. But below, in that earthen-walled chamber, another kind of evening was taking shape. Glass vials lined rough wooden shelves like a congregation of silent witnesses. Each bore a label written in a child's careful hand: poison, danger, do not touch. The words were warnings, yes, but also invitations, markers of thresholds where the known world ended and mystery began. His name was Thomas, though in that cellar he shed the ordinariness of names and became something else: apprentice, questioner, devotee of the unseen. His mother descended the stairs with candles, finding him bent over copper wire and zinc plates, his fingers stained with chemicals whose names he had learned from books borrowed and hoarded. The candlelight caught in the glass vials, transforming the basement into a chapel of amber glow and dark corners, a place where transformation felt not only possible but inevitable. Whispers tell us that his neighbors spoke of explosions, sudden cracks that rattled windows, smoke rising from cellar grates like incense from subterranean altars. Stains appeared on the stone foundation walls, marks that would not wash away, testament to reactions gone wild, to energies released from their careful containment. But these failures were not endings, they were conversations. Each scorched table, each shattered beaker taught him something about resistance and flow, about the delicate balance required to coax power from dormant substances. What did he seek in that underground sanctuary? Not yet the electric light that would later bear his name, not yet the machines that would capture sound and motion. No, what he sought was older than invention, more primal than progress. He sought understanding itself. The way sulfuric acid married with metal to release invisible current. The way copper conducted what iron could not. The way certain combinations of elements, when joined in sacred proportion, could summon spark from stillness, could make the air itself crackle with presence. Beneath the silence of that Michigan basement, time moved differently. Hours dissolved into the singular focus of experiment. Day and night became irrelevant categories. What mattered was only the next test, the next careful measurement, the next hypothesis offered to the patient judgment of natural law. His mother brought him food on wooden trays, found the meals untouched hours later, cold and forgotten beside apparatus that held his complete attention. She did not understand what he was building, but she recognized the quality of his concentration, the way certain minds, certain souls find their calling early and pursue it with monastic devotion. The jars themselves became a kind of archive, a library of potential written in liquid and powder, phosphorus that glowed with ghostly green light, mercury that moved like living silver, acids that could dissolve metal, reduce solid to solution, break bonds that seemed permanent. Each substance offered its own lesson in transformation, its own demonstration that reality was not fixed but fluid, that the world was far stranger and more malleable than common wisdom suggested. Some believe he was teaching himself chemistry, but this understates the deeper current. He was teaching himself to question everything, to accept nothing on authority, to demand that the universe prove itself through repeatable demonstration. This was not merely scientific method, it was a kind of spiritual discipline, a refusal to live in inherited darkness when personal illumination might be possible. Where memory fades into legend, we hear stories of the day a chemical reaction went particularly wrong, a concoction that boiled over, releasing fumes that sent the family fleeing into the yard, coughing and gasping. His father, patience worn thin, threatened to dismantle the entire operation, but his mother intervened. She had seen something in her son's basement vigils that transcended the danger and disorder. She had seen the quality that separates those who will reshape the world from those who merely inhabit it, the unwillingness to leave mysteries unsolved, the hunger to understand that burns brighter than any concern for safety or convention. It is said that the telegraph would later capture his attention, that he would leave home and basement behind for the clicking machinery of communication stations, for night shifts in distant cities where he could continue his education among the hum and spark of electrical apparatus. But what began in that Michigan cellar never truly ended. The method took root there. The patient testing, the systematic elimination of what does not work, the faith that sufficient persistence will eventually yield illumination. The walls of that basement, if they still stand, would tell stories in the stains that mark them. Each discoloration is a moment, a flash of insight, a failed attempt, a lesson learned in the language of chemistry and force. These walls witnessed the birth of something that would later light cities, that would push back the ancient dominion of darkness and make night a mere inconvenience rather than a boundary. Perhaps what is most sacred about that cellar is its ordinariness. It was not a university laboratory with fine equipment and learned professors. It was not funded by wealthy patrons or guided by established science. It was simply a boy, a basement, and an insatiable need to understand. In forgotten corners of the earth, in unremarkable spaces, the future is often assembled from scraps and salvaged materials, from questions asked by voices too young to know what is supposed to be impossible. When his family finally moved, they left behind scorched tables and empty shelves, abandoned apparatus and stained stone. But the basement remembered. In the silence that settled after their departure, the space held the echo of those first experiments, the ghost of that boyhood devotion. Future occupants might have sensed something lingering, not danger, not toxicity, but possibility itself, hovering in the corners like the afterglow of revelation. Marked by the moon through narrow windows, the cellar had been his first laboratory, his first temple, his first conversation with the forces that would define his life's work. The glass vials were gone, but the questions remained floating in the air like dust motes caught in rare sunbeams, waiting for the next curious mind to arrive and ask them again. Beneath the silence, beneath the ordinary rhythm of household life, beneath the floorboards where children played and adults discussed the mundane concerns of daily existence, he had discovered something eternal. That darkness is not the absence of light, but the presence of mystery, and mystery is not enemy but invitation. Every shadow asks to be understood. Every unknown force whispers of potential mastery. Every failed experiment is simply the universe saying, "Not that way, try again." Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. In that Michigan basement, in the amber glow of candles reflecting off glass vials, in the silence between one experiment and the next, the future was already speaking, not in words but in crackle and spark, in chemical reactions and crude electrical flows, in the persistent questioning of a boy who refused to accept that darkness was destiny, that night must remain unconquered, that the invisible forces governing reality must stay forever beyond human understanding. Perhaps it was never meant to be found all at once, the path from cellar to electric grid, from boy to inventor, from darkness to light. Perhaps all great transformations begin in basements and back rooms, in moments of private devotion that no one witnesses except the silent apparatus, the stained walls, the patient architecture of earth and stone that holds space for human curiosity to work its slow magic. The cellar where lightning was tamed, not yet, not literally, but in seed form, in the careful accumulation of knowledge and method that would later bloom into brilliance, stands now only in memory. But what was born there continues, carried forward through every electric lamp, every lit window pushing back the night, every human being who has ever flipped a switch and taken for granted the miracle that such a simple gesture summons obedient light from darkness. Where memory fades, wonder remains. Whispers tell us that he left the basement behind and went looking for electricity in its native habitat, not in jars and homemade batteries, but flowing through the veins of civilization itself, speaking a language older than words. The telegraph stations called to him. In Louisville, in Memphis, in Boston, in a dozen other cities whose names have faded into the general hum of the past, he sat alone in rooms that smelled of oil and ozone and the peculiar metallic scent that accompanies electrical current passing through copper wire. Night shifts, this is important. While others sought daylight positions with their regular hours and human company, he requested the darkness. The late shift, the graveyard watch, the hours when most of the world slept and the wire carried only essential messages, distant and spare, like stars in a vast empty sky. These were the hours he wanted. These were the hours when he could truly listen. It is said that the telegraph key speaks in the language of presence and absence, of connection and void. A dot is a brief closure of the circuit, a dash is a longer communion, and the silence between them is where meaning lives. He learned to read this language not with his eyes but with his entire body, his hand resting on the receiver, feeling the rhythmic pulse, the pattern of electric breath traveling hundreds of miles through wire stretched across wilderness and farmland, over rivers and through mountain passes, carrying human urgency compressed into pure signal. Dot dash dot, dot dot dot, dash dash dash. The messages themselves were ordinary reports of grain prices, notices of arrival and departure, news of births and deaths in distant towns, orders for merchandise, declarations of love, announcements of war. All of human experience reduced to its electrical essence, transformed into rhythmic interruptions of current that his trained fingers could decode without conscious thought. But what fascinated him was never the content. It was the medium itself, the fact that thought could travel without body. That presence could span absence. That copper wire, when properly employed, could abolish distance and make two places one. Other telegraph operators, and there were many in those days, young men mostly, drawn to this new profession that promised steady wages and clean hands, treated the work as work. They arrived at their stations, transmitted and received their assigned messages, played cards during quiet hours, drank coffee, complained of boredom, watched the clock until their shifts ended and they could return to boarding houses and the ordinary rhythms of human life. He did not do this. He could not do this. For him, every moment at the telegraph key was a vigil, a meditation, a form of prayer. The clicking machinery was not merely functional, it was oracle and teacher, riddle and answer both. In the silence between messages, when the wire hummed with potential but carried no actual signal, he heard whispers. Not words exactly, more like promises. Hints of what electricity might become if freed from the narrow purpose of transmitting Morse code, if allowed to speak in richer vocabularies, if permitted to carry not just the skeleton of meaning but the flesh of sound itself, the human voice, music, the entire spectrum of acoustic experience. Beneath the silence of those night watches, he began to see the telegraph not as endpoint but as beginning. The wire could carry dots and dashes, why not continuous tones? The circuit could be closed or open, why not modulated, varied, made to dance with complexity rather than merely alternating between two states? The questions accumulated like pressure behind a dam. He could feel them building, demanding release, insisting on exploration. So he experimented. This was perhaps inevitable. A mind like his cannot merely operate machinery, it must understand it, improve it, question it, push it past its designated boundaries. He modified his equipment, adjusted resistances, added unauthorized components, tested variations in current and timing. The other operators noticed, of course. Some were amused. Others were annoyed, particularly when his experiments interfered with normal transmission, when strange signals bled into routine communications, when equipment that was supposed to be reliable became unpredictable under his restless attention. He was fired more than once. From the Western Union office in Louisville, experiments that melted insulation, that sent confusing signals down the line, that violated the sacred protocols of standardized communication. From positions in Memphis and Indianapolis, always the same pattern. Hired for his obvious skill, his ability to read Morse code faster than almost anyone, to work long shifts without complaint. Then dismissed for his inability to leave well enough alone, for his compulsion to tinker and modify, to ask questions the machinery was not designed to answer. But each dismissal was also liberation. Freed from one station, he would drift to another city, another night shift, another opportunity to continue his real work, which was not the transmission of other people's messages, but the interrogation of electricity itself, the patient questioning of current and wire and the mysterious principles that governed their interaction. Where memory fades into the texture of those years, we can imagine him in a dozen different telegraph offices, all essentially the same room, the same wooden desk, the same apparatus clicking and humming through the darkness. Outside, cities slept, or didn't, he barely noticed. Inside, in the circle of lamplight that held his station, he existed in conversation with something vast and impersonal, something that flowed through the wire from generators he would never see, connecting him to operators he would never meet, carrying messages between strangers in a web of copper and glass insulators that was slowly rewiring human civilization. The telegraph key became his rosary, each click a meditation on distance and connection. Each message received was proof that space could be conquered, that here and there could be made to touch through the medium of electrical pulse. Each silence between messages was an opportunity to wonder what other miracles might be hiding in that humming wire, what other boundaries might dissolve before sufficient ingenuity and persistence. It is said that he slept little during those years. In shabby boarding houses, in rented rooms that held only a narrow bed and a trunk of belongings, he would lie awake replaying the day's observations. His fingers twitched with phantom telegraph rhythms. His mind translated thought into imaginary Morse code. Even his dreams were electrical landscapes of wire and current, visions of messages traveling through darkness, of machines that could do more than click out dots and dashes, that could perhaps carry the full richness of human expression across any distance. Some believe he was lonely during those wandering years. A young man moving from city to city, belonging nowhere, connected to no community except the loose fraternity of telegraph operators who knew him as skilled but strange, brilliant but difficult. but if he was lonely, he never said so. Perhaps the wire was companion enough. Perhaps the constant conversation with electricity, that patient teacher, that demanding master, filled whatever space human friendship might have occupied. Beneath the silence of 1,000 night shifts, beneath the accumulated hours of solitary vigil, something was being forged. Not yet an invention, not yet the phonograph or the light bulb or any of the devices that would later carry his name. What was being forged was method itself, the habit of patient observation, the willingness to fail and fail again without losing faith, the conviction that every system, no matter how established, could be questioned and improved. The understanding that the impossible was simply a name given to things no one had yet figured out how to accomplish. Marked by the moon through telegraph office windows, measured not in days but in messages sent and received, in circuits closed and opened, in the rhythmic pulse of electrical communion spanning vast distances, those years were his true education. Not the books he read, though he read voraciously, teaching himself chemistry and physics and electrical theory from borrowed volumes. Not the experiments he conducted, though each one taught him something essential, but the simple act of sitting in darkness, hand on the telegraph key, listening to the wire sing its binary song, waiting for the silence between messages to reveal its secrets. Perhaps it was never meant to be explained in words what he learned during those nights. Perhaps some education happens below language, in the realm of pure pattern and intuition, where the hand knows before the mind can articulate, where understanding arrives not as conclusion but as recognition, as the sudden certainty that what seemed impossible is actually inevitable if only one approaches it correctly. The wire sang with distant voices, and he listened. Not just to the messages being transmitted, but to the deeper song beneath them, the hum of potential, the whisper of what electricity might become when properly questioned, the promise that darkness and distance were not permanent conditions, but merely challenges waiting for someone patient enough, curious enough, devoted enough to solve them. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. In those telegraph stations, in the oil lamp glow and electrical hum of night shifts spanning years, he became ready. The wire was teaching him its language. The silence was preparing him for what would come next. Where memory fades, the echo remains, dots and dashes, presence and absence, the sacred rhythm of connection pulsing through copper wire, carrying not just messages but the future itself, encoded in electrical heartbeat, waiting to be born. It is said that on a November afternoon in 1877, in a workshop that smelled of machine oil and wood shavings, the impossible happened so quietly that those present almost missed it. Almost, but not quite. Because when the machine spoke, when it returned to the room, a voice that had just moments before existed only as living breath, everyone fell silent. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence that comes when something sacred has occurred and the mind needs time to comprehend what the senses have just witnessed. He had wrapped tin foil around a brass cylinder. Crude work, really. The kind of assembly that looks like it might fall apart if handled roughly. A needle attached to a diaphragm, positioned to touch the foil as the cylinder turned. The theory was simple enough: sound waves would vibrate the diaphragm, the needle would indent the soft metal, creating a physical record of acoustic pressure, a map of air's movement drawn in microscopic valleys and peaks. But theory and reality are different countries, and the border between them is where most dreams die. He leaned close to the apparatus. His assistants gathered around, skeptical but curious. They had seen him fail at 1,000 things. They had learned to maintain appropriate doubt while remaining open to surprise. He turned the crank, setting the cylinder rotating, and shouted into the cone. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. A nursery rhyme. The first words humanity would successfully trap and preserve. Not a profound statement or poetic verse. Not a declaration of love or a prayer or anything particularly meaningful. Just a children's song, simple and familiar, chosen perhaps because its simplicity would make success or failure immediately obvious. The cylinder completed its rotation. The needle had traced its path. Now came the moment of truth or the moment of failure, as had happened so many times before with so many other experiments. He moved the needle back to the beginning of the groove, adjusted something, and turned the crank again. And the machine spoke. Mary had a little lamb. The voice was thin, metallic, barely recognizable as human. It sounded like it was coming from very far away, or from underwater, or from some other realm where sound behaves differently than it does in our ordinary world. But it was unmistakably his voice, his words, his breath captured and returned. Whispers tell us that one of the assistants backed away from the table. Another made the sign of the cross. This was 1877, a world still half convinced that certain boundaries were meant to remain uncrossed, that some mysteries were sacred and should not be violated by human ingenuity. The human voice was breath and spirit combined, the very essence of living presence. It existed in the moment of speaking, and then it vanished, returned to whatever realm from which it came. This was natural. This was proper. This was how things had always been since the first human had ever uttered the first word. Until now. Beneath the silence that followed that first playback, a question hung in the workshop air. What boundary had they crossed? If sound could be held, if the voice could persist beyond the breath that shaped it, what did this mean for every voice that had ever faded into history? What did it mean for the nature of time itself, for memory, for the fundamental assumption that the past was past and could never return? It is said that he played the recording again and again, obsessed with this new miracle, this mechanical memory that could outlast human forgetting. The tin foil wore out quickly. Each playback degraded the recording, the needle wearing away the very grooves it was trying to read, like a monk reading a manuscript written in disappearing ink, each reading erasing a little more of the text until only ghost impressions remained. But he had proven the principle. The impossible was possible. The voice, that most ephemeral of human productions, that pure expression of living moment, could be frozen into metal, preserved, replayed. The absent could be made present. The past could speak into the now. Word spread. In the way that strange news always spreads, traveling through networks of correspondence and newspaper reports, whispered in scientific circles and popular gossip alike. The phonograph, the talking machine, Edison's latest wonder. Visitors began arriving at Menlo Park, his New Jersey compound of workshops and laboratories where such impossibilities routinely became mundane reality. They came to see for themselves, to verify that the reports were not exaggeration or hoax, and he would demonstrate, wind the cylinder, speak into the cone, play back the captured words, watch as wonder and discomfort passed across visitors' faces in equal measure. Some wept, though they could not articulate why. Perhaps they sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between humanity and time. Perhaps they felt the presence of all the voices that had been lost, poets and singers, mothers and lovers, everyone who had ever spoken words worth remembering but whose words had vanished with their final breath. Now such loss was no longer inevitable. Where memory fades, the imagination fills the gaps. We can picture him in that workshop, surrounded by variations of the phonograph, each iteration slightly improved. Wax cylinders replacing tin foil, better needles, improved diaphragms. The systematic refinement that characterized all his work, the patience to test and modify and test again until the merely possible became the reliably functional. But what occupied his thoughts during those months? What did he imagine as the ultimate purpose of this machine that remembered breathing? The applications seemed endless. Singers who would never age, their voices preserved in eternal youth. Speeches that would outlive their speakers' political declarations, sermons, lectures, all rescued from the oblivion that had claimed every spoken word in all of previous human history. Letters that could be spoken rather than written, carrying not just information but tone and emotion, the full texture of human voice, and perhaps most poignantly lullabies. A grandmother singing to children she would never meet, her voice traveling forward through generations, carrying comfort and connection across the terrible distance that separates the living from the dead. The phonograph was, in this sense, a kind of time machine, not moving the listener into the past, but bringing the past forward into the present, making memory tangible, giving ghosts mechanical bodies through which they could speak. Some claimed it was ungodly, that he had stolen something meant to vanish. That the voice was sacred precisely because of its impermanence, its existence only in the living moment. To trap it, to preserve it, to make it repeatable, this was a kind of violation, they argued, a transgression against natural order, but he saw only possibility, only the opening of doors that had been closed since the beginning of human time. Why should the voice be more ephemeral than the written word? Writing had allowed thoughts to persist across centuries. Why shouldn't speaking be granted the same immortality? Beneath the silence of his workshop, late into those November nights, he continued refining the machine, the needle tracking its spiral path through grooves that held captured sound, the cylinder rotating with patient mechanical precision, the cone amplifying whispers of recording back into audible speech. It was all so simple mechanically, so obvious once accomplished. But before it existed, it had been impossible, and that transition from impossible to obvious was his particular gift, his recurring miracle. It is said that the early recordings rarely survived more than a few dozen playbacks. The soft foil or wax could not withstand the friction of the needle. Each listening was also a slow erasure. The voice grew fainter, more distorted, until finally only ghost sounds remained, hints and suggestions of what had once been clearly spoken. Then silence. The recording destroyed by the very act of being heard. There was something almost poetic about this. The phonograph could capture the voice, but it could not yet preserve it indefinitely. The past could be brought forward, but only temporarily, only a few times before it faded again into the same oblivion from which it had briefly emerged. Like memory itself, clear at first, but degrading with each recall, each remembering slightly altering what is remembered, until the original moment is lost behind layers of revision and decay. But he knew this limitation was temporary. Better materials would be found, sturdier cylinders, harder waxes, needles that could read without destroying. The principle had been proven. The rest was merely engineering, patient, systematic, inevitable improvement until the temporary became permanent, until captured voices could survive not just dozens but thousands of playbacks, could outlast the bodies that had produced them by centuries or millennia. Perhaps it was never meant to be perfect at first. Perhaps every great transformation must begin in fragile form, tin foil that wears away, voices that degrade with listening, mechanisms that barely work and require constant adjustment. The seed before the tree, the sketch before the masterpiece, the whisper before the clear declaration. Marked by the spiral groove of that first recording, humanity had crossed into new territory. We had stolen something from time. We had captured breath and made it persistent. We had given memory a voice that did not depend on human recall, that could speak with mechanical accuracy rather than the distortions and revisions that characterize all organic memory. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And now, for the first time, those echoes could be made permanent, could be summoned at will, could be passed forward through generations without loss or mutation. The machine that remembered breathing had changed everything, even if most people did not yet realize it. Where memory fades, the recording remains. Where the living voice falls silent, the captured ghost continues. Where breath ends, the machine speaks on, patient, obedient, faithful to the original moment in ways that human memory can never be. In the workshop's fading light, the phonograph sat silent, waiting. Inside its grooves lived a fragment of the past, a voice, a moment, proof that nothing need be completely lost. That time, though it flows only forward, can be made to repeat itself if only we ask the right questions, if only we build the right machines, if only we refuse to accept that what has always been must always remain. The impossible, once accomplished, becomes merely history. But in the moment of its accomplishment there, in that charged instant when the boundary dissolves, wonder lives, pure and undeniable. And wonder, like the voice on that first recording, deserves to be remembered. It is said that if you had approached Menlo Park on a winter evening in 1878, walking across the frozen New Jersey earth under a sky heavy with stars, you would have seen something that did not belong in the rural darkness. Light, not the warm flicker of hearth fires or the yellow glow of oil lamps burning in farmhouse windows. Different light, brighter, more persistent. streaming from the windows of a long wooden building that seemed to pulse with purpose, like a lighthouse standing watch over fields instead of ocean, guiding not ships but ideas safely into harbor. This was no ordinary workshop, though if you looked at it in daylight, which few did, because those who worked there rarely saw daylight, it appeared unremarkable enough. A two-story frame structure, plain and functional, surrounded by smaller outbuildings and sheds. But something about the place suggested it was more than the sum of its timber and nails. Perhaps it was the way the windows glowed through midnight. Perhaps it was the sounds that emerged, hammering and grinding, sudden exclamations of discovery or disappointment, the hiss of steam and the crackle of electrical discharge. Or perhaps it was simply the atmosphere itself, the sense that inside those walls, the ordinary rules governing what was possible and what was not had been temporarily suspended. He called it his invention factory, but those who worked there knew it as something else, a monastery to the possible, though no prayers were spoken save those muttered over recalcitrant wire and uncooperative glass. A place where failure was not shame but information, where the word impossible meant only not yet accomplished, where the future was being assembled piece by piece, experiment by experiment, through the patient, systematic questioning of everything nature had previously kept secret. Whispers tell us that he gathered around him a particular kind of person. Not the most credentialed universities and their certificates mattered little here, but the devout. Those who understood that real understanding comes not from books alone but from the marriage of theory and practice, from the willingness to get hands dirty, to work through the night, to fail spectacularly, and then begin again with lessons learned and hypotheses refined. They called themselves muckers. The word suggested toil and dirt, the unglamorous reality of invention's physical demands. Machinists and chemists, glassblowers and mathematicians, men whose skills were diverse but whose faith was singular, the conviction that sufficient persistence would eventually yield understanding, that nature could be made to reveal her principles if questioned with appropriate rigor and respect. Beneath the silence of those late-night work sessions, a culture developed. Not the hierarchical structure of traditional workshops where masters commanded and apprentices obeyed. Something more collaborative, more organic. He was first among equals. Certainly the vision was his, the questions were his. The relentless drive forward came from his particular obsession with wresting light and sound from their natural states and making them obedient to human will. But the work itself was collective. Each mucker brought specialized knowledge. Each contributed insights the others lacked. Each failure was examined by the entire group, turned over and studied from every angle until its lessons had been fully extracted. The phonograph had emerged from these rooms, the improved telephone, the carbon microphone that made long-distance voice transmission practical, the taximeter that could measure minute temperature variations, refinements to the telegraph. Experiments with electric lighting that had not yet yielded the incandescent bulb, but were moving systematically toward that goal through the patient elimination of what did not work. Some called it a factory, but this misunderstood the essential nature of what occurred there. Factories produce known objects through established processes. What happened at Menlo Park was different: the systematic creation of the unprecedented, the transformation of question marks into functional devices, the translation of physical principles into practical applications. It is said that time moved differently within those walls. Day and night became irrelevant categories. The muckers slept when exhaustion demanded it, in corners, on benches, wherever they happened to be when consciousness could no longer be sustained. They ate at irregular hours, meals brought in or forgotten entirely in the intensity of focus that comes when a breakthrough seems imminent. They lost track of which day of the week it was, whether it was raining or clear outside, what season held the world beyond their windows. What mattered was the work, the next test, the next modification, the next careful observation that might reveal why this particular configuration failed while suggesting how the next might succeed. Where memory fades into the texture of those months and years, we can imagine the interior of that long building. Benches crowded with apparatus at various stages of completion or decomposition. Glass vessels containing chemicals whose purposes only the chemists fully understood. Coils of wire in different gauges. Batteries in rows, their acid smell mingling with machine oil and wood smoke. Lathes and drills and precision instruments. Shelves lined with materials being tested for various properties, metals and minerals, fibers and fluids, everything that might possibly serve some function in the devices being imagined into existence. The floor was stained with spills and scorched by sparks. The walls were covered with sketches and calculations, diagrams of circuits and mechanical assemblies, notes to self and reminders to others. Every surface bore the marks of intensive use: scratches and dents, burn marks and chemical etching, the accumulated evidence of questions asked and partially answered through physical manipulation of material reality. But more than devices, what grew in that space was a method. The systematic approach to innovation that would later be called research and development, though at Menlo Park they had no such formal name for it. They simply did the work: observe nature, form hypothesis, test through experiment, record results, modify theory accordingly, test again. The patient spiral of understanding, circling closer to truth with each iteration, each failure narrowing the range of possibilities until only the correct answer remained. Beneath the silence of sleeping hours, those rare times when even the muckers had to rest, the apparatus sat waiting. Partially completed devices, experiments paused mid-process. Notebooks lying open to pages filled with observations and questions. The laboratory in repose still hummed with potential, with the promise that tomorrow's work would carry forward what today's had begun, that no effort was ever wasted, that even the most spectacular failure contributed to the accumulated wisdom that would eventually yield success. It is said that visitors found the atmosphere unsettling, the intensity of focus, the casual acceptance of failure. The willingness to work through exhaustion on problems that might not have solutions, pursuing possibilities that might lead nowhere. More than once, a potential investor or curious journalist would arrive expecting to find an orderly demonstration of established capabilities, and instead encounter what looked like chaos: scattered components, failed prototypes, muckers arguing over technical details, the unmistakable evidence of work in progress rather than accomplishments complete. But he understood what others did not, that innovation cannot be scheduled or guaranteed, that breakthroughs come not through careful planning alone, but through the willingness to explore, to wander down uncertain paths, to invest time and resources in questions whose answers are far from certain. Menlo Park was not designed for efficiency in the conventional sense. It was designed for discovery, which requires a different architecture entirely. Perhaps it was never meant to be comfortable. Perhaps the kind of work that transforms civilization requires discomfort, the physical exhaustion of 18-hour days, the mental strain of repeated failure, the emotional toll of pursuing the impossible while critics mock and investors grow nervous. Perhaps greatness grows only in soil that ordinary enterprises would reject as too uncertain, too demanding, too unlikely to yield acceptable returns on investment. Marked by the moonlight that entered through tall windows, measured not in hours but in experiments completed and knowledge accumulated, those years at Menlo Park were building something more permanent than any individual device. They were establishing a new relationship between human curiosity and physical reality, proving that nature's secrets were not permanently sealed but could be systematically revealed through appropriate questioning. Demonstrating that the distance between we don't know and we understand could be crossed through patient, collective, devoted effort. Some believe the greatest invention to emerge from Menlo Park was not the phonograph or the light bulb or any specific device, but the laboratory itself, the proof that innovation could be industrialized, that the creation of new knowledge could be made systematic rather than left to the random inspiration of isolated genius. Before Menlo Park, inventors worked alone in private workshops, pursuing personal obsessions with limited resources. After Menlo Park, the Industrial Research Laboratory would become standard teams of specialists working together on defined problems, funded by corporations or governments, producing innovation as deliberately as factories produced physical goods. But this transformation, like all transformations he initiated, began in a simple wooden building on New Jersey farmland, with a small group of devoted muckers willing to work through the night, willing to fail and fail again, willing to trust that their leader's vision would eventually guide them to something worth discovering. Where memory fades, the legacy remains. The building itself is gone now, or perhaps preserved somewhere as monument. But what was born there continues in every research laboratory, every systematic approach to innovation, every team of specialists gathered around a common purpose, every acceptance of failure as teacher rather than defeat. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. In the patient click of machinery, in the scratch of pencil recording observations, in the quiet conference of minds comparing notes and refining theories, Menlo Park spoke a new language, the language of systematic innovation. The vocabulary of collaborative discovery, the grammar of persistent questioning that refuses to accept mystery as permanent condition. Beneath the silence, the work continues. What began there has never truly ended. The village of sacred failures became the template for how humanity would approach the unknown, not with fear or superstition, but with systematic curiosity, collective effort, and the faith that sufficient persistence will eventually translate darkness into comprehension. The lights that burned through midnight at Menlo Park went out long ago, but the illumination they represented still guides us, still shows the way forward through whatever wilderness of ignorance we currently inhabit, still promises that the impossible is merely the not yet accomplished, waiting for the right questions, the right persistence, the right devotion to make it manifest. And in that promise, wonder lives eternal. It is said that the story of light is written in ash, in the residue of 1,000 materials that blazed briefly and died, in the accumulated dust of experiments that almost worked, that showed promise for minutes or hours before surrendering to the fundamental laws that govern heat and oxygen and the inevitable consumption of all things that burn. The quest began with a simple question: how do you capture the sun? How do you make light that needs no flame, no fuel, no oxygen to sustain it, light that simply persists, obedient and patient, for as long as current flows through its delicate heart? The question was simple. The answer would require years. Whispers tell us that his notebooks from those years read like a catalogue of the almost, a liturgy of materials tested and found wanting. Each entry documents a hope and its dissolution. Carbon filaments that glowed with promise, then crumbled. A platinum wire that cost a fortune and failed within hours, the metal's high melting point making it theoretically ideal but practically useless. It conducted too much heat away from the filament, preventing the steady glow necessary for practical illumination. Thread that carbonized beautifully, but could not sustain its own radiance for more than a few flickering moments. The problem was fundamental. To produce light, the filament must be heated to incandescence, brought to a temperature where it glows white hot. But at such temperatures, most materials oxidize instantly, combining with oxygen in the air to form ash and smoke. Or they simply melt, their molecular structure unable to maintain integrity under such extreme conditions. Or they sublimate, transforming directly from solid to vapor, leaving behind only ghost traces of their brief existence. What was needed was a material that could withstand this punishment, that could be heated until it radiated visible light yet remained structurally sound, that could maintain this impossible balance not for minutes but for hours, ideally for hundreds or thousands of hours, long enough to make electric lighting practical rather than merely theatrical. Beneath the silence of his Menlo Park laboratory, the testing began, systematic, exhaustive, methodical as meditation. If one material failed, another would be tried, and another after that. The universe contained countless substances, organic and inorganic, natural and synthetic, common and rare. Surely among them existed the one material, the perfect filament, that would solve this ancient problem of how to tame light and make it serve human will. He tested lampblack mixed with tar, various forms of carbonized organic matter, metals in pure form and in alloys. Fibers of every description: cotton, linen, silk, each carbonized according to careful procedures designed to preserve their thread-like structure while transforming them into carbon. Human hair was tried, fishing line, cork, flax, bamboo from Japan arrived in crates, shipped across oceans on the theory that perhaps some plant from a distant land might possess the properties local materials lacked. It is said that his assistants grew weary. The same process repeated endlessly with only the material changing. Prepare the filament, mount it in the glass bulb, evacuate the air to create vacuum because early experiments proved that oxygen was the enemy, that even a little air inside the bulb would cause the filament to burn away almost instantly. Seal the bulb, connect to the electrical circuit, apply current, observe, measure how long the filament glows before it fails, record the results, begin again with a different material. Hours of preparation for moments of testing. Weeks of work producing only negative results, not this material, not that one either, not this preparation method or that thickness or this particular treatment. The accumulation of what does not work, while the question of what might work remained unanswered. Critics mocked his persistence. Journalists wrote dismissive articles. Investors began to wonder if their money was disappearing into a bottomless well of futile experimentation. Even some of the muckers, those devoted workers who had followed him through previous triumphs, began to doubt. How long could one pursue a goal that remained perpetually out of reach? How many failures could be endured before admitting that perhaps this particular problem had no solution, that electric light might remain forever a laboratory curiosity rather than becoming practical infrastructure? But he had learned something essential during those years with the telegraph, in that Michigan basement, through every previous challenge he had faced and overcome. Failure was not the opposite of success, it was the path to success. Each material that failed taught him something. Each negative result eliminated one possibility, narrowing the field, bringing him incrementally closer to the answer that must exist somewhere in the vast catalog of possible materials and methods. Where memory fades into the granular detail of those experiments, we can imagine the quality of that work, the patience required, the systematic nature of the testing. This was not inspiration or sudden flash of genius. This was something older, more sacred, the methodical questioning of nature, the refusal to accept no as a final answer, the faith that reality contains solutions to every properly formulated question if only the questioner persists long enough, systematically enough, devotedly enough. The notebooks filled with observations, drawings of filament structures, measurements of resistance and current, calculations of how long each material sustained its glow before failure. Notes on preparation methods, at what temperature to carbonize organic materials, for how long, under what atmospheric conditions. Every variable was tested, adjusted, tested again. Every hypothesis was examined through the only lens that mattered. Does it work? Can it be made to work? If not, what does its failure teach us about what might? Beneath the silence of those 1,000 failures, a kind of wisdom accumulated. Not the wisdom of books or formal education, but the wisdom that comes from intimate familiarity with materials and their properties, from hours spent observing how substances behave under stress, from the patient accumulation of empirical knowledge that no amount of theoretical reasoning could provide. It is said that the breakthrough came not as sudden revelation, but as gradual recognition. Carbonized bamboo. Not American bamboo, the Japanese variety showed superior properties. Something about its fiber structure, its density, the way it responded to the carbonization process. When tested, it glowed and continued glowing, hour after hour. The yellow warm light steady and patient, fed by the invisible current flowing through copper wire from generators humming in adjacent buildings. The first successful test lasted 1,400 hours, 58 days of continuous operation. The filament finally failed not because the material was inadequate, but because even perfection has limits, because all things eventually surrender to entropy and time. But 1,400 hours was enough, more than enough. It proved that practical electric lighting was possible, that the dream of illuminating homes and streets and cities with clean, safe, flameless light could be realized. Perhaps it was never meant to be easy. Perhaps the 1,000 failures were necessary not just to eliminate incorrect answers, but to teach the deeper lesson about persistence itself, about the faith required to continue when success seems impossibly distant, about the kind of devotion that treats each setback not as defeat but as information, as one more step on the path toward inevitable triumph. Marked by the glow of that first successful bulb, burning hour after hour in the Menlo Park laboratory, a new era began. Not immediately, there were still countless problems to solve before electric lighting could become infrastructure. Generators had to be designed, distribution systems planned, economic models developed. The single successful bulb had to be multiplied into millions. The laboratory success had to be scaled into industrial production. But the essential question had been answered. Light could be tamed. Darkness was not destiny. The ancient evening ritual of lighting candles and oil lamps, the careful management of flame and fuel, the constant awareness of fire's danger, all of this could be replaced by the simple gesture of completing a circuit, allowing current to flow, commanding light to appear as obediently as water flows from an opened tap. Some believe that what he proved through those 1,000 failures was more important than the light bulb itself. He proved that systematic experimentation works. That persistence overcomes impossibility, that the distance between we cannot and we have is measured not in inspiration but in patient, methodical, devoted work. That nature keeps her secrets but will reveal them to those who ask properly, who refuse to accept mystery as permanent, who treat each failure as teacher rather than tormentor. Where memory fades, the light remains. Not just the physical bulbs, though billions would eventually be manufactured, illuminating every corner of the inhabited world, but the metaphorical light as well. The proof that human ingenuity can overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. That darkness, whether literal or figurative, is not final. That sufficient persistence will eventually translate shadow into comprehension, ignorance into understanding, the impossible into the everyday. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The 1,000 failed filaments speak a lesson that transcends their individual failures. They whisper that the path to breakthrough is paved with setbacks, that great achievements require not just vision but the willingness to fail spectacularly and repeatedly. That the distance between darkness and dawn is crossed not in a single leap but through accumulated steps, each one bringing us closer even when it feels like we're getting nowhere. Beneath the silence, beneath the accumulated ash of all those failed experiments, a truth glows eternal. Darkness was never permanent, it was only waiting. Waiting for someone stubborn enough, systematic enough, devoted enough to ask the right questions and persist until reality revealed its answers. The sun captured, the night conquered, the ancient tyranny of darkness, overthrown by carbonized bamboo and patient persistence, and the refusal to accept that what had always been must always remain. In that refusal, in that persistent questioning, in that systematic exploration of every possibility until the right one finally revealed itself, there lives something sacred. Something that honors both the universe and the human spirit. The universe for being knowable, for containing answers to properly formulated questions. The human spirit for refusing to stop asking, for treating mystery as invitation rather than warning, for believing that sufficient devotion will eventually be rewarded with understanding. And so the light burned, hour after hour, day after day. A small captive star, proof that the impossible was merely the not yet accomplished, waiting for the right material, the right method, the right persistence to make it manifest. Where wonder lives, darkness dies. And in the glow of that first successful bulb, humanity stepped into a new relationship with the night, no longer its subject, but its master. The 1,000 darknesses before dawn were not wasted. They were the price of illumination, and in the end the price was gladly paid. It is said that the modern world began on a September afternoon in 1882, though most who witnessed it did not recognize the boundary they were crossing. There was no ceremony, no ribbon cutting or speech making. Just a man's hand on a switch, the closing of a circuit, and 400 lamps blooming into light across lower Manhattan like flowers opening to a sun that rose not from the horizon but from beneath the city streets. Pearl Street Station. The name sounds ordinary now, carries no particular weight or wonder. But on that day it became the heart of a new nervous system threading through urban earth copper veins buried in trenches, carrying invisible current from steam-powered generators to buildings that had never before known light without flame. Before this moment, electric lighting had been curiosity, demonstration. The kind of spectacle that drew crowds to exhibitions and world's fairs, where people marveled at arc lights bright enough to hurt the eyes, harsh and sputtering, useful perhaps for illuminating factory floors or theater stages, but far too crude, too expensive, too dangerous for domestic use. Gaslight ruled the evening hours, yellow and wavering, requiring careful tending, always carrying the whisper of danger, the knowledge that flame and fuel meant the constant possibility of fire. But what began that September afternoon was different. This was not spectacle, this was infrastructure. The quiet revolution that happens when the experimental becomes the assumed, when the impossible transforms into the ordinary, when miracle becomes service that can be purchased for pennies per hour. Whispers tell us that at 3 o'clock, somewhere in the basement machinery of Pearl Street Station, the switch closed. In that instant, current began flowing through underground cables that snaked beneath cobblestone streets, branching and dividing, following paths carefully planned to bring power to specific addresses, specific buildings, specific rooms where incandescent bulbs waited in their sockets like seeds waiting for the signal to bloom. In the offices of the New York Times, editors and typesetters glanced up as the bulbs flickered to life. Steady light, white and clean and constant, no smell of gas. No heat from open flame, no need to adjust wicks or replace fuel. Just light, summoned by the simple existence of current, obedient as water flowing downhill, asking nothing except that the circuit remain complete. In J.P. Morgan's mansion, that temple to wealth and power where decisions affecting entire industries were made over cigars and brandy, the electric lights glowed in their crystal fixtures. Morgan had been an early believer, an investor who saw past the risk to the revolutionary potential. His mansion became showcase and proof of concept both. Visitors would arrive expecting the usual gaslights and instead encounter this new illumination, would see the future in every room, would understand that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between humanity and darkness. Beneath the silence of that first hour of operation, something ancient was ending. The rhythm that had governed human life since the first fire was struck in some prehistoric cave, the rhythm of light and dark, of day for work and night for rest, of activities carefully scheduled around the availability of natural illumination. This rhythm was not yet broken, but it had been challenged. The tyranny of sunset had been questioned. It is said that not everyone celebrated. Some mourned what was being lost. The romance of gaslight with its warm yellow glow, its gentle wavering that made shadows dance and rooms feel alive with movement. The intimacy of candlelight, the ritual of lighting and extinguishing flames, the attention that fire demanded and deserved, the ancient rhythm of darkness falling and humans retreating indoors, surrendering the night to its proper masters, to stillness and dream and the deep rest that comes when the visible world fades to black. Electric light felt different. Colder, some said, though the bulbs actually produced less heat than gas flames. Harsher, more insistent. It did not ask permission or cooperate with mood. It simply was constant and unwavering, the same brightness at midnight as at dusk, making no concessions to the hour or to human preference for gentle transitions. But most people, when they first encountered it, simply switched on the lamp and forgot the miracle they were commanding. I forgot the thousands of experiments that had been necessary to make this casual gesture possible. Forgot the generators humming in the Pearl Street basement, the copper cables buried in trenches, the complex infrastructure of production and distribution that had to exist before that simple switch could summon light. This forgetting was, perhaps, the truest measure of success. When technology becomes invisible, when it recedes into the background of daily life and is noticed only in its absence, then it has truly arrived. The light bulb was becoming not a wonder but a utility, not a miracle but an assumption, not something to marvel at but simply the new condition of evening. where memory fades into the texture of that first night, we can imagine him walking the streets of Lower Manhattan, watching his lights bloom in windows, counting the buildings connected to his system. Seeing the future he had imagined in countless night shifts at telegraph stations, in that Michigan basement, through years of failed filaments and persistent testing, seeing it made manifest in electric glow pushing back against the September darkness. What did he feel in that moment? Pride, certainly. The satisfaction of vision realized, of impossible made actual, but perhaps also a touch of melancholy, because every ending contains loss, even when the ending is also a beginning. The world he had known, the world of gaslight and candle flame, of darkness as fundamental condition rather than technical problem, that world was fading. The new world he had helped create would be brighter, safer, more convenient, but also more restless, more resistant to the natural rhythms that had once governed human existence. Beneath the silence of his evening walk, the city was changing. Not all at once. Pearl Street Station served only a small district, only 400 lamps in a city of millions. But the change had begun. Other stations would be built, more cables laid. The grid would spread block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, until eventually darkness became optional rather than inevitable, until night lost its power to dictate human activity, until the question was not, can we have light, but simply, do we want it? It is said that the infrastructure mattered more than the bulb itself. Any competent glassblower could make a light bulb once the principle was understood. But the system that delivered power to that bulb, the generators, the cables, the switches and meters, and all the invisible machinery that made electricity a service rather than a laboratory phenomenon, this required different genius entirely. Not the flash of invention, but the patience of engineering. Not the breakthrough, but the systematic building of infrastructure. Pearl Street Station represented this different kind of achievement. It proved that electric power could be generated reliably, transmitted safely, distributed efficiently, and sold profitably. It transformed electricity from scientific curiosity to commercial commodity, from wonder to product, from impossible to inevitable. Perhaps it was never meant to be romantic. Infrastructure rarely is. The beauty is not in the individual components, but in the system itself, in the elegant solution to complex problems of generation and distribution, in the quiet reliability that allows ordinary people to take miracles for granted. Marked by the glow of those first 400 lamps, humanity stepped across a threshold. We had claimed the night, not completely, not yet, but enough to prove it could be done. Enough to show that darkness was not destiny, but merely the absence of sufficient infrastructure. Enough to demonstrate that the ancient evening ritual could be replaced by something simpler, cleaner, safer. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The hum of those first generators spoke a new language, the language of power on demand, of light as utility, of darkness transformed from inevitability to choice. Those who heard it really heard it, understood what it meant, knew that everything was about to change. Where wonder lives, tradition fades. The gaslighters who tended street lamps each evening, climbing ladders with their long poles to ignite each flame, their profession had become obsolete. though they did not yet know it. The gas companies that had invested fortunes in infrastructure, their dominance had been challenged, though they would fight for decades before surrendering. The architects who designed buildings around the assumption of gaslight and candles, they would need to reimagine their craft for a world where light could come from anywhere, controlled by switches on walls rather than matches in hands. Beneath the silence, the generators hummed, steady, patient, inexhaustible, converting coal and steam into rotary motion into electrical current into light that asked nothing and gave everything, that served without complaint or fatigue, that would burn as long as fuel fed the furnaces and machinery remained sound. The station where night surrendered was not a battlefield but a basement. The weapons were not swords but copper wire and carbonized bamboo. The victory was not proclaimed with trumpets but announced through the simple, quiet glow of incandescent bulbs turning darkness into day at humanity's convenience. What began in a Michigan cellar had become civic infrastructure. What started with a boy questioning invisible forces had rewoven the fabric of urban life. What seemed impossible had become, in the span of a single afternoon, merely real. And in that transformation from impossible to real, from wonder to utility, from miracle to infrastructure, something profound had shifted. Humanity had taken another step toward mastery of the physical world. We had stolen something from nature's monopoly. We had made light portable, controllable, obedient to human will. Some believe the victory was incomplete, that something was lost when we traded natural darkness for artificial light. That the ancient rhythms serve purposes we do not fully understand, that the night has wisdom to teach that can only be learned in darkness. Perhaps they are right, perhaps every advance carries hidden costs, perhaps illumination, like all powers, must be used wisely or it becomes its own form of blindness. But on that September afternoon, such philosophical concerns felt distant. What mattered was simpler, more immediate. The switch had been thrown, the current was flowing, the lights were burning. Night had surrendered its absolute authority. Darkness remained, would always remain, but it was no longer master, it was merely the default condition that humans could choose to dispel with a gesture no more complicated than closing a circuit. Where memory fades, the light remains, steady, patient, waiting for us to ask for it. And when we do, when we reach for the switch without thinking, expecting illumination as our right rather than our privilege, we are living in the world that September afternoon created. The world where night knows it has been defeated, where darkness understands it serves now at our pleasure, where the ancient tyranny of sunset has been overthrown by generators and copper wire, and the stubborn refusal to accept that what had always been must always remain. In that refusal, in that quiet revolution humming beneath city streets, wonder lives eternal even when we forget to notice it. It is said that every great truth contains within it the seed of conflict, not because truth is divisive by nature, but because the path toward truth can branch in different directions, each route seemingly correct, each vision of the future equally compelling to those who hold it. And when two such paths diverge, When two prophets stand at the crossroads, each pointing a different way forward, what follows is not mere disagreement, but something deeper, a contest not just of technologies, but of philosophies, of worldviews, of fundamental assumptions about how power should flow through civilization. Between Edison and Tesla, between the steady pulse of direct current and the oscillating dance of alternating current, lay more than technical dispute. Here were two visions of electricity's future, two maps for how invisible force should be harnessed, transmitted, and delivered to the lamps and motors and machines that would define the coming century. Two prophets, each convinced of their own path's righteousness, each unable to see wisdom in the other's vision. Whispers tell us that Edison saw electricity as something to be controlled through proximity. His was a world of small generating stations distributed throughout cities, each serving a limited district, each maintaining intimate connection with the homes and businesses it powered. Direct current flowed in one direction only, steady, predictable, safe in its consistency. Like a river moving from high ground to low, it asked only for a clear path and sufficient voltage to overcome resistance. His generators at Pearl Street and stations like it produced this reliable one-way flow, sending it through copper cables to buildings a few blocks distant, rarely more than a mile. There was something philosophically satisfying about this vision. Power generated close to where it was consumed, systems small enough to be understood and managed by local operators. A control maintained through human scale, through infrastructure that could be walked and inspected, through relationships between producer and consumer that remained direct and tangible. But physics imposed limits. Direct current lost itself over distance. The electrical resistance of copper wire, minimal over short runs, became insurmountable across miles. A current bled away as heat, dissipating into the metal itself, until at distances beyond a few thousand feet, so much power was lost in transmission that the system became impractical. To serve a city required dozens or hundreds of small generating stations, each with its own staff and machinery, each serving only its immediate neighborhood. Beneath the silence of his Menlo Park laboratory, Edison worked to perfect this vision. Better generators, more efficient lamps. Improved meters for measuring consumption. The systematic refinement of direct current infrastructure, making it more reliable, more affordable, more practical. He had proven the concept at Pearl Street. Now it was simply a matter of replicating that success, building station after station, wiring city after city, creating a network of local power centers that would together illuminate the nation. Then came the challenge. Not from a rival businessman or competing inventor, but from a different vision entirely. Alternating current, a system where the flow of electricity reversed direction many times per second, oscillating between positive and negative, forward and back, in rhythmic pulse that seemed unnatural, almost violent compared to direct current's steady march. Tesla saw what Edison could not or would not. That alternating current's oscillation was not weakness but strength. That this rhythmic reversal allowed for transformation, for the voltage to be stepped up or down through devices called transformers, making it possible to send power at very high voltages across vast distances with minimal loss, then step it back down to safe levels for consumption. A single generating station could serve an entire region. Niagara Falls could power Buffalo 20 miles distant. Hydroelectric plants in mountains could illuminate valleys hundreds of miles away. It is said that when Edison first encountered this rival system, backed by George Westinghouse and powered by Tesla's brilliant but alien vision, he recognized the threat immediately. Not just to his business interests, though those were considerable, but to his understanding of how electricity should work. Direct current was knowable, masterable. Alternating current felt dangerous, unpredictable, too powerful to be trusted in ordinary hands. So began what history would call the War of Currents, though it was less war than philosophical divide made manifest through commercial competition. Edison, who had spent his life making the impossible practical, now found himself defending the limitations of his own system against a technology that promised to transcend those limitations entirely. Where memory fades into the darker chapters of this contest, we find demonstrations that tarnish Edison's legacy. Public exhibitions where animals were electrocuted with alternating current to demonstrate its dangers, pamphlets warning of deadly voltages, theatrical displays meant to frighten the public away from the competitor's technology, the birth of the electric chair, deliberately designed to use alternating current, associating the rival system with death and punishment. These were not his finest moments. The man who had patiently tested thousands of materials to find the right filament, who had built his success on systematic questioning and empirical testing, now resorted to fear and spectacle to defend a system that physics had already judged inadequate. But perhaps we should not judge too harshly. He was fighting not just for market share, but for a vision he genuinely believed to be safer, more controlled, more appropriate for human use. In his view, alternating currents' high voltages represented genuine danger. The ability to transmit power across vast distances meant centralization of control, monopolistic power concentrated in fewer hands. His distributed network of small stations preserved local autonomy, prevented dangerous consolidation. Beneath the silence of that ideological struggle, physics was rendering its verdict. The contest would not be decided by rhetoric or demonstration or public relations, but by reality itself. And reality favored Tesla's vision. Direct current could not efficiently serve cities spreading beyond a few square miles. It could not harness distant waterfalls or deliver power across mountain ranges. It was fundamentally limited by distance in ways that alternating current was not. The decisive proof came at Niagara Falls. That ancient thunder of water falling over stone cliffs, that primal power that had existed since the glacier's retreat carved the landscape into its current form, was harnessed to generate alternating current. Transmitted at high voltage to Buffalo, 20 miles distant, stepped down through transformers to power streetlights and factories and homes. The system worked beautifully. Proved beyond doubt that centralized generation and long-distance transmission were not just possible but superior to the distributed model Edison championed. It is said that he rarely spoke of this defeat in later years, that it shadowed him the knowledge that the infrastructure of the electrical age would bear not his imprint but another's, that the grid spreading across continents would hum with alternating frequencies he had opposed, that his direct current system would become historical curiosity, studied in textbooks but obsolete in practice. Yet both men had been right about something essential. Electricity would indeed transform the world, would light cities and power machinery and fundamentally alter human civilization. They differed only in the technical details of how that transformation would occur, in the shape the electrical network would take as it spread across the landscape. Perhaps it was never meant to be personal. Perhaps the conflict between direct and alternating current was simply physics working itself out through human agency, with Edison and Tesla serving as representatives of competing principles rather than as individuals locked in vendetta. The universe was testing both approaches, using these two brilliant minds to explore different possibilities and reaching its own conclusion about which path forward served the greater purpose. Marked by the oscillating pulse of alternating current 60 cycles per second in most of the world, 50 in some regions, the grid emerged. Not Edison's vision of distributed local stations, but Tesla's dream of power transmitted across distances that would have seemed impossible just decades before. Hydroelectric dams in remote gorges, coal-fired plants positioned near fuel sources rather than population centers, nuclear reactors in isolated facilities, all feeding into a network that spans continents, that synchronizes millions of generators and billions of consuming devices into a single vast organism pulsing with electromagnetic life. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Edison's insistence on safety and local control speaks to legitimate concerns that remain relevant even now. Centralized infrastructure creates centralized vulnerability. Long-distance transmission means power can be cut off by distant failures. The monopolistic consolidation he feared did indeed occur, with enormous utilities controlling generation and distribution across vast territories. But Tesla's vision of abundant power transmitted efficiently across distance made possible the electrification of rural areas, the harnessing of renewable resources far from cities, the creation of an integrated grid that could balance supply and demand across time zones and weather systems. Where wonder lives, both prophets found truth. Edison in his caution and care for human-scale systems, Tesla in his boldness and recognition that distance need not limit distribution. The war between them produced better technology than either might have achieved unopposed. Conflict, however painful, forced innovation that cooperation might not have demanded. Beneath the silence, the current flows, alternating, oscillating, following Tesla's vision, but lit by bulbs born from Edison's persistence. Both men necessary, both contributions essential. The war between them long over, but its legacy persisting in every wire, every transformer, every home touched by the miracle of electrical service. Perhaps they were never truly enemies, despite the bitterness of their public contest. Perhaps they were collaborators separated by time and perspective, each playing necessary roles in electricity's emergence from laboratory to infrastructure, from wonder to utility, from impossible dream to assumed right. The frequency hums eternal, carrying power across distances Edison thought impossible, lighting bulbs his persistence made practical, serving a world both men helped create even as they fought over the shape it would take. In that humming, in that pulse of current reversing direction 60 times per second, two visions merge into single reality, and wonder, indifferent to human conflict, flows on. It is said that time moves in only one direction forward, relentless, carrying each moment from possibility into existence and then immediately into memory. The present exists only as niffage between future and past, impossibly thin, gone before we can fully comprehend it. This has been the human condition since consciousness first awakened, to live always in the vanishing now, unable to hold or preserve or return to any moment once it passes. Until the machine learned to remember not just sound, but motion itself. In the kinetoscope, frames flickered past faster than thought, each one a frozen instant, a dancer's foot touching ground, a boxer's fist extended, a wave crashing against sand, separate images still and lifeless on their own. But when run through the machine at sufficient speed, something miraculous occurred. The eye, which cannot perceive individual frames arriving faster than a certain rate, blended them together, interpreted the sequence as continuous motion, saw not 24 separate photographs per second but fluid movement, the illusion of time captured and made repeatable. Whispers tell us that he did not invent motion pictures alone. Many hands contributed to this particular miracle. Many minds worked on the problems of capturing sequential images, of projecting them at speeds that fooled the eye into perceiving motion. But he systematized the process, made it practical, housed it in arcades where people paid their nickels to peer through viewfinders at loops of living moments, at reality tamed into repetition. The films themselves were brief seconds or minutes at most. The technology could not yet sustain longer narratives, but length was not the point. What mattered was the impossibility made manifest, that movement could be frozen, stored, replayed. That the past could be made present not just in static image or recorded sound, but in full motion, in the gestures and expressions and physical reality of bodies moving through space. Beneath the silence of those early viewing parlors, something profound was happening. People stood in line to watch a dancer turn, to see a strongman lift impossible weights, to witness a kiss Mary Irwin and John Rice, their lips meeting in what might be called cinema's first intimacy. The film lasted less than a minute. Barely a film at all by later standards, just a close framing of two people kissing, the camera unmoving, the action minimal, yet it scandalized. Not because the kiss itself was shocking, people kissed in life after all, but because it had been captured, made permanent, repeatable. The intimate moment that should exist only between two people, only in the fleeting present, had been stolen and made available for strangers' eyes. It could be watched again and again, the same kiss forever arriving at the same moment, never progressing beyond that frozen intimacy. It is said that some viewers found the kinetoscope disturbing in ways they could not quite articulate, something uncanny in watching these captured movements. The people in the films were clearly real, had been real at the moment of filming. But were they still themselves when transformed into flickering images? If a person died, did some essence of them persist in these mechanical memories? Could the dead speak not just through phonograph recordings but through moving images? Could they gesture and walk and perform long after their bodies had returned to dust? These were not idle philosophical questions. They struck at fundamental assumptions about presence and absence, about what it meant to be alive versus what it meant to be recorded. The camera, people said, did not lie. It captured reality with mechanical objectivity, without the distortions of human perception or the failures of human memory. What appeared in the frame was what had been before the lens, truth, pure and unfiltered, but this was already a kind of fiction. The camera did not lie, perhaps, but it did not tell complete truth either. It showed one angle, one fragment, one carefully selected portion of reality. The frame was itself an editorial decision, including some elements while excluding others, and the images were arranged, edited, presented in sequences that created narrative or spectacle from what had been mere happenstance. Even documentary was already becoming fiction, selection masquerading as objectivity, arrangement pretending to be simple observation. Where memory fades into the texture of those early films, we can imagine what it was like to watch them. The darkened viewing booth. The peephole, the flickering images appearing and disappearing, each frame visible for only a fraction of a second before being replaced by the next. The slight stutter and jump that came from imperfections in the mechanism, from the difficulty of maintaining exactly consistent speed. The monochrome world of gray tones, all color drained away, leaving only light and shadow to describe reality. Yet despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, the kinetoscope films possessed a kind of magic. They were obviously not real in the sense of being present, three-dimensional, tangible, but they were not merely fictional either. They existed in some intermediate state between reality and representation, between document and dream. They were ghosts in a sense, shadows of moments that had once been fully real but now persisted only in mechanical reproduction. Beneath the silence of the viewing booths, people watched trains arriving at stations, saw locomotives approaching the camera, growing larger in the frame until some viewers instinctively drew back, convinced despite all logic that the metal beast would burst through the screen and into their space. Others watched acrobats and dancers, prize-fighters and showgirls, slices of life captured from vaudeville stages and circus tents and boxing rings. But what they truly watched, what they were really witnessing through that narrow peephole, was time made captive, reality tamed into repetition. The flow of moments arrested and imprisoned in celluloid, made to perform the same actions endlessly, trapped in eternal return like some mechanical reincarnation where nothing ever changes, where the same kiss arrives forever at the same instant, where the same wave breaks eternally against the same shore. It is said that he understood the commercial potential immediately. Kinetoscope parlors opened in cities across America and Europe. Machines lined the walls like confessionals, each one offering its own brief vision, its own captured fragment of reality. People moved from booth to booth, spending their nickels freely, hungry for these glimpses of motion preserved, for this new form of experience that was neither theater nor photograph but something entirely unprecedented. The content evolved quickly. Simple recordings of performances gave way to narrative fragments, to staged scenarios, to the beginnings of what would become cinema's grammar. The language of cuts and angles, of framing and timing, of how to tell stories through moving images rather than merely recording whatever happened before the lens. Perhaps it was never meant to remain confined to peepholes. The kinetoscope was threshold technology proof of concept that would lead to projection, to screens large enough for audiences to watch together, to the eventual emergence of cinema as communal experience rather than solitary viewing. But in its original form, there was something intimate about the kinetoscope that later projection would lose. The viewer alone with the machine, the private encounter with captured motion. The sense that these flickering ghosts were performing only for you, in the darkness of your viewing booth, in the brief moments you had purchased with your coin. Marked by the flicker and stutter of those early frames, a new art form was being born, not yet recognized as art that would come later, after longer films and more sophisticated techniques, and the realization that moving images could do more than record reality, could interpret and transform and create meanings that transcended mere documentation. But the seed was planted. In those brief kinetoscope loops, in those seconds of captured motion, in the miracle of making time repeatable and motion permanent, something essential had changed in humanity's relationship with experience itself. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The kinetoscope whispered truths about perception and reality, about presence and absence, about the difference between living a moment and recording it. It suggested that experience could be divorced from the experiencer, that one person's reality could be packaged and sold to another, that the boundaries separating observer from observed were more fluid than previously imagined. Where wonder lives, questions multiply. If motion could be captured, what else might be preserved? If the past could be made to perform on command, what did this mean for memory, for history, for the stories we tell about who we were and what happened? If reality could be frozen and replayed, how would this change our understanding of truth, of evidence, of the reliable nature of human testimony? Beneath the silence, the projector hummed, though not yet, not in those early kinetoscope days. That would come soon, the leap from peephole to screen, from solitary viewing to communal experience. But already in those flickering frames visible only to one person at a time, the grammar of cinema was being written, the vocabulary of cuts and angles. The rhythm of editing, the recognition that moving images could tell stories, could evoke emotions, could create meaning through the arrangement of captured moments. Cowboys could shoot without bullets flying into the crowd. Disasters could be witnessed without fleeing. Exotic locations could be visited from the safety of storefront parlors. Life could be examined from distance, from safety, frame by frozen frame. Experience became portable, commodifiable, reproducible. The unique and unrepeatable, the hallmarks of lived reality, gave way to the endlessly repeatable, the mechanically preserved, the ghostly persistence of moments that refused to vanish as moments should. Perhaps they are still there, those early kinetoscope viewers, frozen in their own kind of loop, still leaning forward to peer through peepholes, still watching the same brief films that astonished their grandparents, still caught in the spell of captured motion, of time made circular, of the impossible made casual through the magic of persistence of vision and mechanical precision. The chapel of captured motion held no pews, no altar, no explicit acknowledgement of the sacred. But sacred it was nonetheless, a place where humanity encountered one of its own deepest powers, the ability to arrest time's flow, to hold motion still while keeping it moving, to make the past present without losing its pastness. Some believe we are still watching those first films in a sense, that every motion picture since has been variation on that original miracle, that first successful attempt to capture and replay the flow of time itself, that the grammar discovered in those crude early efforts still governs how we see and understand moving images, how we interpret the flicker and flow of light and shadow arranged to create the illusion of continuous motion. Where memory fades, the images remain, stuttering, flickering, ghostly. But undeniably they're proof that what passes need not be lost, that what moves can be stopped without dying, that time itself can be tamed and trained to perform at human command. In the darkness of the viewing booth, reality and representation embraced. And from that embrace, cinema was born, an art form that would come to define the 20th century, that would shape how millions understood themselves and their world, that would blur forever the boundaries between actual and virtual, between experience lived and experience witnessed. The machine that remembered breathing had a sibling. The machine that remembered movement. Together they promised that nothing need ever be completely lost, that presence could persist across absence, that the past, properly captured, could be made to speak and gesture and perform eternally. And in that promise wonder and melancholy mingled, wonder at what had been achieved, melancholy for what it suggested about the nature of reality itself, that it could be copied, commodified, endlessly reproduced, that the unique could become infinite, that the sacred present moment could be arrested and sold for a nickel to anyone who wanted to watch. Where wonder and melancholy meet, art is born. And so it was with the kinetoscope, with those first flickering frames, with the chapel of captured motion where humanity learned to see itself from outside time, to witness motion without being moved, to observe life from the safe distance of mechanical reproduction. The kiss continues, the train eternally approaches, the dancer never stops turning. In the darkness, in the flicker, in the eternal present of the captured frame there, motion lives forever, neither fully alive nor finally dead, but suspended in the amber of celluloid, waiting for eyes to watch, for mechanisms to turn, for the miracle to manifest once more. And manifest it does every time, patient, eternal, unchanged, the past made present, motion made permanent. A time, that relentless river, momentarily stilled into repeatable pools where we can return again and again to drink from the same impossibility. It is said that in his later years, when the great battles had been won and lost, when electric light glowed in cities across the world and his name had become synonymous with invention itself, he turned his restless mind toward an unlikely subject. Not electricity or sound or motion, but something more fundamental, more intimate. He became haunted by the question of shelter, by the domestic architecture that housed humanity, by the simple, ancient need for walls and roof and the space between them where families lived their ordinary lives. He looked at American housing and saw waste, saw inefficiency, saw wood that rotted and burned, that required constant maintenance, that sheltered termites and mice in its hidden spaces, saw construction methods that had barely changed in centuries, carpenters measuring and cutting and nailing boards together one by one, each house a separate creation, each one requiring months of skilled labor and substantial investment. There had to be a better way. Concrete, he believed, was the answer, not just for foundations or industrial structures, but for everything. Entire houses poured in single operations from forms, walls, floors, ceilings, even furniture molded into place as the concrete set. Neighborhoods that could rise in weeks rather than months. Working families freed from tenement darkness, given homes beautiful and durable, with gardens and sunlight, with the permanence of stone and the affordability of mass production. Whispers tell us that his vision was genuinely humanitarian. He had illuminated the night, had given humanity dominion over darkness. Now he would give them shelter worthy of that illumination, homes that would stand for centuries, that would not burn in the fires that regularly destroyed wooden neighborhoods, leaving families homeless and grieving, that would resist the rot and decay that made poverty perpetual, that forced the poor to spend precious resources maintaining inadequate housing while the wealthy built in brick and stone. The prototypes rose in New Jersey. Whole houses manifested from his particular faith in material science and industrial process. The concrete was poured into enormous steel forms that defined every room, every wall, every surface. Plumbing and electrical conduits had to be planned absolutely before the poor pipes and wires embedded in the forms, positioned with precision because once the concrete set, there would be no adjusting, no retrofitting, no accommodation for the improvisations that real living inevitably demands. Beneath the silence of those construction sites, something was being tested, not just a building technique, but a philosophy of dwelling. The idea that housing could be industrialized, standardized, perfected through engineering, and then replicated endlessly. That the chaos and variability of traditional construction could be replaced by precision and uniformity. That homes, like light bulbs, could be manufactured rather than built, could emerge from forms the way products emerge from factories. It is said that the houses, when completed, were aesthetically successful. Their lines were clean, their proportions well considered. The concrete allowed for ornamental details that would have been expensive in traditional materials, decorative moldings cast directly into walls, built-in furniture that required no separate fabrication. From the outside, they looked substantial and permanent, like small temples to domesticity, solid as the earth from which they rose. But inside, reality proved more complicated. Concrete, however practical, lacked wood's warmth. Rooms had a peculiar acoustic quality, sounds echoed in ways that felt unnatural. Conversations carried from room to room when privacy was desired. In winter, the houses were difficult to heat evenly. In summer, they retained heat long past sunset. The material's thermal mass, which in theory should have moderated temperature, in practice created its own rhythms that did not quite align with human comfort. And there were other problems, less tangible but equally troubling. Surfaces sweated with condensation. The inability to modify walls or move plumbing meant that as families grew or needs changed, the house could not adapt. Traditional homes evolved with their inhabitants, a room added here, a wall moved there, the structure breathing and changing as life demanded. But concrete houses were fixed, permanent, unyielding as the material from which they were made. Where memory fades into the economics of the venture, we find the dream stumbling against prosaic realities. The steel forms required to pour concrete houses were enormously expensive to fabricate. Each form had to be precisely engineered, had to be strong enough to hold tons of wet concrete without deforming, had to be reusable enough to justify the initial investment. The forms for a single house cost as much as building several traditional homes. The promise had been mass production. Build the forms once, then use them hundreds or thousands of times, the cost amortized across all the houses they would produce. But American builders, comfortable with wood and traditional methods, did not adopt the system. Banks were reluctant to finance such unconventional construction. Buyers, even working families desperate for affordable housing, hesitated before these strange concrete dwellings that looked like no home they had ever known. Beneath the silence of failure, a question whispered, why had this dream, so carefully planned, so thoroughly engineered, failed to take root? He had succeeded at seemingly impossible tasks, capturing sound, freezing motion, illuminating the world. Why should housing prove beyond his ability to revolutionize? Perhaps because homes are not light bulbs, cannot be reduced to pure function and engineering. A house is more than shelter, it is memory and symbol. It is the physical container of family life. It carries meanings that resist standardization. The very permanence that made concrete attractive as material also made it troubling as domestic architecture. Homes need to change because life changes. The inability to modify, to adapt, to let the structure evolve, this was not feature but flaw. It is said that a dozen concrete houses still stand in New Jersey, small monuments to what nearly was. Families live in them still, or lived in them until recently, finding them strange but serviceable, cold but durable. Tour guides point them out to visitors interested in Edison's lesser-known experiments, in the roads not taken, in the visions that failed to manifest despite the brilliance of their conception. What do these houses whisper to those who pass them? Perhaps they speak of hubris, the assumption that all problems yield to the same methods, that what works for electric lighting must work for human dwelling. Or perhaps they speak more gently of noble failure, of genuine humanitarian impulse that simply could not overcome the complexities of culture and economics, and the deep human need for homes that feel like more than optimized shelter. Marked by the permanence of their construction, the concrete houses became ironic monuments. They proved that some innovations, equally sound in theory, wither before they can propagate. That success in one domain guarantees nothing about success in another. That even the most systematic mind, the most persistent questioner, must sometimes accept that certain dreams will not be realized, certain visions will remain forever partial. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The concrete houses spoke truths about the limits of systematization, about the domains where human factors resist pure engineering solutions, about the difference between products and homes, between objects and dwelling places. But perhaps the world was not ready to hear these lessons, or perhaps it heard them too well, and that is why the dream ended. Where wonder lives, failure teaches. He had lit the world, captured sound and motion, transformed human civilization. But he could not rebuild the American home in his image, could not industrialize domesticity the way he had industrialized invention, could not reduce dwelling to engineering and expect families to accept the result without reservation. Perhaps it was never meant to succeed. Perhaps some experiments exist to mark boundaries, to show where one approach ends and different wisdom must begin. The concrete houses stand as testament to this boundary, the edge where material science meets human meaning, where optimization encounters values that resist quantification. Beneath the silence, the houses endure, outlasting wood structures that have rotted away, surviving fires that consumed their neighbors. Proving at least part of the vision correct, that concrete provides durability, that these homes would stand for generations. But standing is not the same as thriving. Survival is not synonymous with success. Some believe the failure was timing, that if he had persisted another decade, had refined the methods further, had found ways to make the forms less expensive and the process more flexible, perhaps the concrete house movement would have gained momentum. Perhaps America would be dotted with these poured dwellings, neighborhoods of permanent homes that never burn or rot, that stand as solid as the earth itself. But perhaps the failure was deeper, more fundamental. Perhaps homes resist industrialization because they must, because the very standardization that makes mass production efficient makes dwelling sterile. Because families need their homes to reflect their particularity, their uniqueness, their specific constellation of needs and dreams and memories that no poured form, however well designed, can fully accommodate. The dream of concrete forests of neighborhoods rising quickly from forms, of working families housed affordably in permanent structures faded but did not quite die. Elements of the vision persisted. Concrete became ubiquitous in construction, though rarely for entire houses. The idea of manufactured housing continued through different approaches: prefabrication, modular construction, various attempts to industrialize what had always been craft. But none quite achieved what he envisioned. None manifested that particular dream of neighborhoods poured into being, of homes as durable as monuments, of shelter made so permanent that generations could inhabit the same walls without fear of decay or destruction. Perhaps they are still waiting, those concrete forests. Still unrealized, still hovering in possibility, waiting for the right combination of technology and culture and economic necessity to finally bring them forth. Or perhaps they will remain forever partial, forever suggested but never fulfilled, another road not taken in the vast landscape of might-have beens. Where memory fades, the houses remain, a dozen concrete monuments to ambitious failure, to the limits even genius encounters. To the recognition that some domains resist the methods that succeed elsewhere, to the humility that comes when the impossible stays impossible despite our best efforts to make it otherwise. In the end, he had illuminated cities but could not rebuild them, had captured sound and motion, but could not capture the ineffable qualities that transform shelter into home. Had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation in most endeavors, but failed here, in this late attempt to extend his reach into the domestic realm. And perhaps that failure contains its own form of grace. The recognition that there are problems engineering cannot solve, that there are human needs deeper than optimization can reach. That homes, unlike light bulbs, must remain mysteries that resist complete systematization, that demand craft and customization, that need to breathe and change and evolve with the lives they contain. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The concrete houses speak softly of these truths, waiting in New Jersey, standing solid, enduring but not multiplying, not spreading, not becoming the forests he dreamed they would, just monuments, just memories. Just whispers of what almost was, and what for reasons both practical and profound could not quite become. Where wonder meets limitation, wisdom grows. And in the space between vision and reality, between dream and dwelling, the concrete houses wait, patient, permanent, and ultimately alone. It is said that in his 70s, when most men turn inward toward memory and rest, when the body demands gentler pursuits and the mind seeks contemplation over conquest, he turned instead to gardens. Not the ornamental kind, not flowers arranged for beauty's sake, but experimental plots, thousands of plant species standing in rows like a living library, each one holding potential answers to questions the world had not yet learned to ask properly. The telegraph and phonograph belonged to his youth, the light bulb and motion pictures to his middle years. But this patient interrogation of botanical secrets, this became the work of his autumn, a different kind of invention, a different kind of listening. Not to wires and circuits, but to roots and stems, to the slow chemistry of chlorophyll and cellulose, to the ancient wisdom encoded in plant tissue since long before humanity learned to wonder. Rubber had become strategic necessity. The modern world rolled on it automobile tires, electrical insulation, gaskets and seals, and countless industrial applications. Every bit of it imported from tropical regions, from plantations in distant lands, from rubber trees that would not grow in American soil. The dependence troubled him. What if war or politics disrupted supply? What if the price became prohibitive? A nation that could not produce its own rubber was a nation vulnerable, dependent on others for a material as essential as steel or oil. Whispers tell us that he established experimental gardens in Fort Myers, Florida, where winter never truly arrived, where growing seasons stretched long and generous. Greenhouses rose, glass structures that caught sunlight and held it, that created microclimates for species from every corner of the earth. He hired botanists and agriculturalists, men who knew plant families and their properties, who could identify species from leaf shape and stem structure, who understood the subtle alchemies by which plants manufactured the compounds humans found useful. The quest was systematic, as all his quests had been. Test everything, every plant native to America, every species that might be coaxed to grow in American climates. Anything that produced latex, that milky sap that was rubber's raw form, the plant's own protective fluid transformed through processing into elastic solid. Beneath the silence of those botanical gardens, a kind of patience developed that was different from the patience of his earlier work. Machines could be tested in hours or days. Results arrived quickly. This material works, that one fails, move to the next. But plants demanded their own rhythms. Seeds required time to germinate. The seedlings needed weeks to grow. Mature specimens had to reach sufficient size before they could be harvested and tested. The work moved at nature's pace, not at the accelerated rhythm of industrial innovation. It is said that he tested milkweed, those roadside plants with their pods full of silky seeds, sagebrush from western deserts, desert shrubs whose names were known only to botanists, plants from the South American highlands, Asian species that might adapt to North American conditions. His laboratory accumulated specimens like a botanical museum, dried samples, liquid extracts, measurements of latex content recorded in notebooks that grew thick with observations. Each plant offered its own lesson in chemistry. Some produced copious latex but of quality too poor for manufacturing. Others yielded excellent rubber but in quantities so small that harvesting them commercially would be impractical. Some grew too slowly. Some required too much water or too specific soil conditions. Some refused to thrive outside their native ranges no matter how carefully they were tended. But goldenrod showed promise. Those tall stalks with their sprays of yellow flowers, common across American meadows and roadsides, typically ignored as weeds or valued only for their late-season color. Under his cultivation, under selective breeding that favored height and latex production, they grew 12 feet tall, robust, fast-growing, producing acceptable rubber when their stalks were crushed and processed. Where memory fades into the texture of that botanical work, we can imagine him walking through experimental plots. An old man now, partially deaf, his hearing loss making conversation difficult but leaving him more attuned to visual observation, touching leaves, measuring stalks, examining the milky sap that oozed from stems when they were scored. Still seeking, still questioning, still convinced that nature held answers if only the right questions were posed with sufficient patience. There was something beautiful in this late turn toward plants. After a lifetime of mastering electricity and mechanics, of bending metals and glass to human will, he returned to the organic, to the living, to the slow green wisdom of photosynthesis and growth. The laboratories of his youth had smelled of chemicals and ozone. These gardens smelled of earth and chlorophyll, of growth and decay working in their eternal cycle. Beneath the silence of morning rounds through the greenhouses, through the experimental fields where goldenrod stood in ranked rows, perhaps he found a different kind of communion than electricity had offered. Plants did not respond to persistence the way materials did. You could not force them, could not test them to destruction and immediately try another approach. They demanded respect for their own timings, their own needs. They taught patience not as method but as necessity. It is said that he imagined plantations of goldenrod stretching across the south, fields of these modified plants bred for maximum rubber production, providing America with domestic sources of this strategic material. Harvested annually, the stalks crushed and processed, their latex extracted and transformed into the rubber that industry demanded, independence from foreign supply. Security through botanical innovation, the same systematic approach that had lit the world now applied to agriculture. But natural rubber from goldenrod never became practical. The chemistry worked, the latex could indeed be processed into usable rubber. The plants grew vigorously under cultivation. All the technical problems could be solved. Yet economics rendered its verdict with the same finality that physics had decided the war of currents. Tropical rubber plantations produced more cheaply. The vast acreage required for goldenrod cultivation could not compete with established production methods. And even as he worked, synthetic rubber was emerging from chemical laboratories, petroleum-derived, consistent in quality, independent of plant cultivation entirely. Perhaps he knew, even as he worked, that this quest was unlikely to succeed commercially. Perhaps by his 70s he no longer measured success purely in terms of adoption and profit. Perhaps the work itself had become the point, the patient observation, the systematic testing, the daily walk through gardens where questions grew alongside plants, where failure taught lessons different from those learned in workshops but no less valuable. Marked by the yellow blooms of goldenrod reaching 12 feet toward Florida skis, the botanical experiments became their own kind of success. The notebooks filled with observations about American flora, species catalogued. Latex content measured across hundreds of plants, methods developed for extraction and testing. Knowledge accumulated that might not have immediate application but would be there, preserved, available for anyone who came later asking similar questions. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The goldenrod whispered truths about the limits of pure optimization, about the domains where factors beyond engineering determine outcomes. The best material grown most efficiently can still fail if economic conditions do not support it. Innovation is necessary but insufficient. It must arrive at the right moment, must answer genuine need, must fit within the larger systems of production and distribution. Where wonder lives, acceptance grows. He had spent his life making the impossible ordinary, had transformed darkness and silence into commodities, had given humanity powers previous generations would have called magical. But rubber from goldenrod remained outside his ability to manifest, not because the technical challenges were insurmountable, but because success requires more than solving technical problems. Beneath the silence of those final botanical years, a different kind of wisdom accumulated. The recognition that nature has its own economy, its own logic that sometimes aligns with human purposes and sometimes does not. That plants are partners rather than materials, collaborators rather than resources to be exploited. That working with living things requires humility that working with electricity and mechanics does not demand. It is said that the aged inventor, walking through gardens of experimental plants, touching leaves and measuring stalks, still seeking answers in nature's vocabulary, found a kind of peace different from what success had ever offered. The goldenrod would not save America from rubber dependence. The dream of domestic latex plantations would not be realized. But the work continued because the work itself had value, because questioning nature remained its own reward, because the systematic pursuit of understanding was worthy endeavor regardless of commercial outcome. Perhaps they still grow somewhere, those modified goldenrod plants, 12 feet tall, carrying in their tissues the potential for rubber production that economics rendered irrelevant. Perhaps in some forgotten corner of the Fort Myers property, descendants of his experimental varieties still bloom each autumn, still produce their milky latex when stems are scored, still hold the answer to a question the world chose not to ask. Some believe the botanical quest was failure. Another late career miscalculation, another overreach into domains where his genius found its limits. But perhaps it was something else entirely, a return to origins, to the boy in the Michigan basement questioning chemicals and compounds, to the fundamental wonder that comes from observing nature closely and seeing how much remains mysterious, how much still waits to be understood. Where memory fades, the notebooks remain. The 3 million pages across all his experiments, but among them the botanical observations, sketches of leaf structures, measurements of plant heights, notes on growing conditions and latex content. Not commercially valuable, perhaps, but valuable nonetheless as record of curiosity that never dimmed, of questioning that persisted into the 8th decade of life, of the conviction that every plant, like every material, had properties worth knowing. The ghost of rubber haunted those gardens. The possibility that never quite became practical. The dream of fields stretching across American South, of independence and security grown from cultivated stalks. It remains a ghost still visible in notebooks, in preserved specimens, in the dozen goldenrod varieties he bred and tested, but never fully manifested in the world of commerce and production. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some quests exist not to succeed, but to remind us that there are questions worth asking even when answers prove elusive. That there is value in systematic observation even when it does not yield marketable products. That the pursuit of understanding is worthy endeavor in itself, regardless of outcome. The old inventor, partially deaf, walking through gardens where goldenrod reached toward sky, still believed in questions, still trusted that nature would teach those patient enough to listen. Still knew that failure to find practical application did not mean failure to learn, to grow, to add something to the accumulated wisdom of human inquiry into natural mysteries. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The goldenrod speaks of roads not taken, of possibilities explored but not pursued, of the space between technical success and commercial viability. It speaks of aging inventors' gentle persistence, of curiosity that outlasted ambition, of the peace that comes from working with living things at their own rhythms rather than forcing them to conform to industrial timings. Where wonder meets acceptance, grace emerges. He had illuminated the world, had captured sound and motion, had given humanity dominion over darkness. That he could not also give America independence from rubber imports diminished nothing. The goldenrod remained tall and golden, blooming each autumn, holding its small secrets, teaching its patient lessons to anyone willing to walk among the experimental rows and observe what grows when questions are planted in good soil and tended with systematic care. Beneath the silence, the gardens breathe, growing, blooming, teaching, waiting for the next questioner to arrive with notebooks and patience, ready to learn what plants have always known, ready to translate green wisdom into human understanding, ready to continue the work that has no ending because nature's mysteries are inexhaustible. And in that inexhaustibility, in the recognition that there will always be more to learn, more to test, more to understand, wonder lives eternal, green and growing, patient as goldenrod reaching toward light. It is said that in his final years, when most of the great work had been accomplished and the world glowed with lights bearing his name, when sound could be captured and motion preserved and night had surrendered its ancient dominion, he turned his attention to the last and greatest darkness. Not the darkness of unlit rooms that he had already conquered, but the darkness that waits at the end of all journeys, the silence that claims every voice. The final boundary that separates the living from those who have passed beyond, death itself. Whispers tell us that he spoke publicly of designing apparatus to contact the dead, not spiritualism or seance theatrics, not mediums in darkened rooms claiming to channel departed spirits through mysterious means, something different, something mechanical. Something that could be tested and refined, that would approach the boundary between worlds with the same systematic methodology he had applied to every other problem: patient observation, careful hypothesis, empirical testing. The newspapers carried his statements, scientists sighed, critics scoffed. The public, accustomed to his transformative innovations, did not quite know what to make of this latest announcement. Was he serious? Or was this elaborate jest, the aged inventor amusing himself by testing the boundaries of credibility, by seeing how far his reputation for achieving the impossible would carry belief in this new impossibility? Beneath the silence of his laboratory, in those final working years, he considered the question that had haunted humanity since consciousness first awakened to its own mortality. If sound waves could be captured by diaphragm and needle, if their vibrations could be frozen into wax and later recalled, why not the subtle energies that consciousness might radiate? If light could be transformed into electrical current, current into motion, motion into preserved images, why not the faint signals that the departed might send from whatever realm they now inhabited? It is said that he conceived of instruments of extreme sensitivity, devices so delicate they could detect the faintest whispers from dimensions beyond ordinary perception. apparatus that would translate whatever ethereal frequencies spirits employed into measurable physical phenomena, electrical pulses perhaps, or thermal variations, or some other manifestation that could be recorded and analyzed. His notes mention life units, fundamental particles of existence that might persist beyond the body's failure. Not soul in the religious sense, not consciousness as philosophers debated it, but something more physical. Irreducible elements of being that might obey natural laws not yet discovered, that might exist in states science had not yet learned to measure. If such particles existed, if they retained some coherence after death, then sufficient sensitivity might detect them, might record their presence, might even establish communication. Where memory fades into speculation about his true beliefs, we encounter mystery. Did he genuinely think such apparatus possible? Or was this late-life meditation on mortality's meaning, the mind that had spent decades making the invisible visible now wondering if the ultimate invisibility, death itself, might yield to the same systematic questioning? There is no evidence any working device emerged from these investigations. No spirits reported through his apparatus. No breakthrough that brought the dead speaking back into the realm of the living. The boundary remained intact. The veil stayed drawn. Whatever lay beyond death kept its secrets despite his systematic attempts at revelation. Yet the impulse reveals something essential about him, about the particular quality of mind that characterized his entire life's work, the refusal to accept any mystery as permanently closed. The conviction that sufficient ingenuity could answer any question, bridge any divide, illuminate any darkness. Death, the final shadow, was simply another challenge to be examined, another code to be deciphered, another problem awaiting the right approach. Beneath the silence of those final experiments, perhaps there lived a different motive than mere mechanical curiosity. He had lost loved ones, as all who live long enough must lose, friends and colleagues, his first wife, Mary, who died young. Others who had populated his laboratories and workshops, who had worked beside him through countless nights, who had shared in the systematic questioning of nature's secrets. Where had they gone? Did some essence of them persist? Could they be reached if only the right questions were asked in the right way? It is said that grief sometimes masquerades as science, that the equations and apparatus and systematic testing can be ways of holding on, of refusing to accept that certain absences are final. If true, then these late experiments were not so different from the phonograph, another attempt to make the absent present, to preserve what would otherwise be lost, to deny death its complete victory. But this time the attempt failed, or appeared to fail. No device bridged the divide, no mechanism translated messages from beyond. The departed remained departed, silent despite all his systematic attempts to coax them into communication. Perhaps he expected this outcome. Perhaps by his final years he had learned enough about failure to recognize when a question had no answer, or at least no answer accessible through the methods available to him. Perhaps the public announcements about death detection apparatus were less about actual invention and more about keeping alive the possibility, about refusing to grant death complete authority, about maintaining the stance of persistent questioning even when answers seemed impossibly distant. Marked by the absence of results, the spirit communication experiments became monuments to a different kind of failure than the concrete houses or the goldenrod rubber. Those had failed for economic or practical reasons. The solutions worked but did not fit within larger systems of production and use. But this failed more fundamentally. The apparatus could not be built because the phenomena it was meant to detect might not exist, or might exist in ways that transcended physical measurement entirely. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. Perhaps the departed speak only in memory, in dream, in the unexpected moments when the living suddenly recall with overwhelming vividness some gesture or phrase or quality of presence that defined the dead when they were living. Perhaps the apparatus for detecting them is not mechanical but psychological, not something that can be built in laboratories, but something that exists already in the architecture of grief and remembrance. Where wonder lives, acceptance grows. He had spent his life making the impossible ordinary, had given humanity dominion over darkness and silence and distance, had proven again and again that the boundary between cannot and can was more permeable than assumed, that systematic persistence could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. But death remained unconquered. The final darkness stayed dark. The ultimate mystery kept its secrets, and perhaps this was fitting. Perhaps there should be one frontier that remains forever beyond, one question that human ingenuity cannot answer through mechanical means, one silence that no apparatus can translate into sound. Beneath the silence of his workshop in those final years, gathered instruments bore witness to this last quest. Sensitive measuring devices, experimental apparatus designed to detect energies science had not yet named. Notebooks filled with speculation about life units and their persistence, about dimensions beyond the three we inhabit, about the possibility that consciousness might be something more than electrochemical reactions in neural tissue. No breakthrough came, no spirits materialized, no device successfully bridged the divide. But the attempt itself speaks of something admirable: the refusal to stop questioning, the determination to test even the most unlikely hypotheses, the conviction that mystery is invitation rather than warning. It is said that he died in 1931 at 84, having transformed civilization but failed in his final quest. Did he discover in dying whether the apparatus was possible? Did he learn what waited beyond the veil he had tried to penetrate? Did his life units, if they existed, persist in some realm science cannot reach? We cannot know. He crossed the boundary he had tried to examine from this side, and like all who cross it, he sent back no messages that our instruments can detect. If he speaks now, it is not through mechanical apparatus, but through the legacy he left: the lights that still burn, the recordings that still play, the systematic approach to innovation that continues in every research laboratory. Perhaps it was never meant to be mechanical, this communication with the departed. Perhaps the real apparatus for hearing them is simpler and more complex than any device: the human heart that remembers, the mind that carries forward the lessons they taught, the work that continues in their absence, building on foundations they laid. Some believe he failed at this final challenge because it was impossible. That death's boundary cannot be crossed by any mechanism, that the departed are truly departed, that consciousness does not survive the body's failure in any form that could be detected or communicated with. Others believe he simply lacked the right tools, the right understanding, that future science might yet discover the frequencies on which the dead speak, might build the apparatus he could only imagine, that his failure was one of timing rather than fundamental impossibility. But perhaps the deepest truth is that he succeeded differently than intended, not by building working apparatus, but by refusing to grant death unchallenged authority, by maintaining until the end the stance of persistent questioning, by treating even the final mystery as problem rather than fate, as question rather than answer, as invitation to investigate rather than boundary to accept without examination. Where memory fades, the questions remain. What lies beyond? Do we persist? Can the boundary be crossed or at least examined more closely? These are not new questions. Humanity has asked them since the first human buried the first dead and wondered where they had gone. But he asked them in his own particular way, with hypothesis and apparatus, with systematic testing and empirical methodology, with the conviction that nature's laws extend even into realms we cannot yet perceive. The voice from beyond the veil remained silent, or at least remained inaudible to mechanical ears. But in the attempt to hear it, in the persistent questioning that characterized even his final experiments, something of his essential nature was revealed. The boy who questioned chemicals in a Michigan basement, the young man who heard potential in telegraph silences, the inventor who refused to accept darkness as permanent, all present still in the old man wondering if death itself might yield its secrets to sufficient ingenuity. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. His voice echoes still not from beyond some veil, but through the work he accomplished, through the light and sound and systematic innovation that remain after he departed. If there is communication with the dead, perhaps it takes this form: the continuation of their work, the building on their foundations, the carrying forward of their questions into new generations. Beneath the silence, the mystery endures. Death keeps its secrets. The veil stays drawn. The final darkness remains unilluminated despite all his efforts to translate it into comprehension. And perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps some mysteries should remain mysterious. Some darkness should stay dark. Some questions should echo unanswered, reminding us that human knowledge, however it grows, will always encounter limits, will always find boundaries that resist crossing. In his workshop, the apparatus gathered dust. The spirit-detecting mechanisms, if they were ever built, detected nothing. The life units, if they existed, left no measurable trace. The voice from beyond the veil spoke only in silence, but the attempt mattered, the persistent questioning mattered, the refusal to accept any mystery as permanently closed, this mattered most of all. Where wonder and humility meet, wisdom dwells. He had illuminated the world but could not illuminate death. Had captured sound and motion but could not capture the departed, had made the impossible ordinary in so many domains, yet found in death the one impossibility that remained impossible. And in that recognition, in that final failure, that ultimate limitation, perhaps he found what all seekers eventually find, that some questions are worthy of asking even when they have no answers, that the pursuit matters more than the achievement, that wonder itself is the reward, not the solutions wonder seeks. The voice from beyond the veil stayed silent, but the voice that questioned it, that refused to accept silence as final answer, that persisted in asking even when no reply came, that voice still echoes, patient and eternal, in every question asked by those who refuse to grant mystery the last word. It is said that when he died in October 1931, at 84 years old, having lived through the transformation of the world he had helped create, he left behind more than patents and products, more than light bulbs and phonographs, more than the electric grid humming across continents. He left behind something more intimate, more revealing, more enduring than any device could ever be. He left behind his questions, 3 million pages. Notebooks stacked in archives, their leather covers worn from handling, their pages filled with cramped handwriting that grew more difficult to read as his hearing faded and age accumulated. Sketches crowded the margins. Calculations marched across pages in columns of careful figures. Observations recorded in the moment of discovery, the temperature at which a filament glowed, the resistance of a particular wire, the way a chemical solution changed color when current passed through it. These pages are not polished documents. They are not meant for publication or display. They are working records, the raw material of thought made visible, the process of invention laid bare in all its false starts and sudden insights, its patient accumulation of knowledge toward breakthroughs that arrived not as lightning but as slow dawn. Whispers tell us that to read these notebooks is to witness a particular mind's peculiar journey through the landscape of the possible. Here a sketch of the first phonograph, crude diagram showing cylinder and needle, the spacing of components, the angle at which the diaphragm should be mounted. Their calculations about electrical resistance, pages of figures testing different wire gauges and voltages, searching for the optimal combination that would deliver light efficiently across distance. And everywhere scattered through all 3 million pages the evidence of failure, materials tested and found wanting, hypotheses disproven. Approaches abandoned after systematic testing revealed their inadequacy. The 1,000 darknesses documented before dawn finally arrived, the accumulation of what does not work, which is also the accumulation of wisdom, the slow narrowing of possibilities until only the correct answer remains. Beneath the silence of those archived pages, a method reveals itself. Not the myth of solitary genius struck by sudden inspiration, but something more pedestrian and more profound, the systematic questioning of nature, the patient testing of every variable, the refusal to accept mystery as permanent when mystery might yield to sufficient persistence. It is said that the patents bear his name alone, but the notebooks reveal collaboration. Muckers and machinists whose contributions went unrecorded in official documents but whose skills were essential to every breakthrough. the glassblower who perfected the technique for creating vacuum and light bulb envelopes, the chemist who knew which solvents would dissolve which compounds, the mathematician who checked calculations and spotted errors before they became expensive failures. His gift was not solitary brilliance, but the ability to orchestrate collective effort, and to maintain direction through thousands of failures toward eventual success, to keep the vision clear even when the path forward seemed hopelessly obscured, to recognize which questions were worth pursuing and which should be abandoned, which collaborators brought essential skills and which approaches had already proven futile. The notebooks document this orchestration, notes to assistants about which experiments to prioritize, reminders to himself about promising materials that deserved further testing. Observations that began as hunches and slowly accumulated supporting evidence until they hardened into reliable principles. The texture of innovation as it actually occurs messy and nonlinear, full of backtracking and revision, success built on foundations of systematic failure. Where memory fades into the granular detail of those pages, we find something unexpected. Not just technical documentation, but glimpses of the human being behind the inventions. A frustration when experiments failed repeatedly, excitement when breakthroughs arrived, exhaustion recorded in handwriting that grew more cramped and hurried as midnight approached and beyond. The simple notation, tried again, appearing hundreds of times, testament to persistence that would not accept defeat as final. Marked by ink and graphite, preserved now in Climatech-controlled archives where scholars can request specific volumes and turn their pages with careful hands, the notebooks whisper lessons that transcend their technical content. They teach that genius is not spontaneous flash but patient accumulation. That understanding comes not through revelation but through the systematic testing of ideas against reality, through the willingness to be wrong and learn from wrongness, through the faith that sufficient questioning will eventually be answered by the patient universe. Beneath the silence of those archived words, another truth emerges. The work was never finished. Even in his final years, even after the great achievements had been secured and his reputation established, the notebooks continued to fill. New questions, new observations, new materials to test. The systematic curiosity that had driven him from that Michigan basement through decades of innovation never dimmed, never accepted that understanding was complete, never stopped asking what else might be possible if only the right questions were posed with sufficient care. It is said that in his final illness, when the body was failing and death approached with its ancient inevitability, he remained himself to the end. Not bitter about the spirit communication apparatus that had never manifested, not regretful about the concrete houses or goldenrod rubber or any of the visions that had not fully realized. Simply himself, the questioner, the systematizer, the one who treated darkness not as enemy but as teacher, who understood that failure was information rather than defeat. He died as he had lived mid-question, mid-investigation, surrounded by the apparatus of inquiry, the notebook still waiting for observations that would now never be recorded, the experiments that would remain forever incomplete. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. His voice echoes still in every electric lamp, in every recorded sound, in every motion picture, in every systematic approach to innovation that treats the impossible as merely not yet accomplished. The devices themselves will eventually become obsolete already. The incandescent bulb is giving way to newer technologies. Already phonograph cylinders are museum curiosities. But the method persists. The patient questioning, the systematic testing, the refusal to grant mystery permanent authority. Where wonder lives, legacy grows. The notebooks rest in archives, digitized and cataloged, available to anyone curious enough to read them. Graduate students mine them for insights. Historians examine them for evidence about the nature of innovation. But their deepest value may be more spiritual than practical, the testimony they bear to the power of persistent questioning, to the faith that reality contains answers to properly formulated questions, if only the questioner refuses to stop asking. Beneath the silence of those 3 million pages, beneath the accumulated observations and calculations and sketches and notes, a single lesson glows with the steady patience of well-made light. Darkness was never permanent. It was only waiting. Waiting for someone systematic enough, persistent enough, devoted enough to ask the right questions and continue asking until reality revealed its answers. The boy who questioned chemicals in a Michigan basement became the man who illuminated the world. Not through magic or divine gift, but through the patient application of method: observe, hypothesize, test, record, revise, test again. The spiral of understanding, circling closer to truth with each iteration, each failure narrowing the possibilities until only the workable remained. It is said that on the night he died, President Hoover asked the nation to dim its lights in tribute. For 1 minute at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, lamps across America were turned low or extinguished entirely. The cities went dark, streets fell into shadow. The electric grid that had spread across the continent in the decades since Pearl Street Station, all of it dimmed in recognition of the man whose persistence had made it possible. Then the lights came back on, as they always had, as they always would, obedient to the simple closing of circuits, responding to human will made manifest through copper wire and carbonized filaments, pushing back the darkness just as they were designed to do. Perhaps this was the most fitting tribute, not permanent darkness in his memory, but temporary dimming followed by renewed illumination. Because his legacy was not darkness conquered, but the proof that darkness could be conquered, not the absence of night, but the tools to transform night into day at human convenience. Where memory fades, light persists. Not just the physical bulbs, though billions still burn, evolved from his original designs, but recognizably descended from them. But metaphorical light as well, the illumination that comes from systematic questioning. The brightness of understanding wrested from ignorance through patient effort. The glow of problems solved through persistence rather than inspiration. The library of persistent light exists not in any single building but distributed across archives and museums, across the electric grid itself, across every research laboratory that employs the methods he helped establish. 3 million pages of notebooks. Countless devices bearing his innovations. But more than these physical artifacts, what persists is the example itself, the life lived in systematic questioning of nature's mysteries, in refusal to accept the impossible as permanent, in faith that sufficient devotion to understanding would eventually be rewarded. Some believe the greatest invention to emerge from his workshops was not any device, but the proof that invention itself could be systematized. That innovation need not depend on random inspiration, but could be made deliberate, could be pursued through organized effort, could be achieved through patient application of method rather than waiting for genius to strike. Beneath the silence, the lesson continues. In every experiment conducted, in every hypothesis tested, in every researcher who treats failure as information rather than defeat, in every systematic approach to problems that seem insurmountable. The method spreads through education and example, through the accumulated culture of scientific inquiry, through the simple recognition that what worked for electric light and sound recording might work for other challenges humanity faces. Perhaps it was never meant to end. Perhaps the work he began in that Michigan basement continues still, carried forward by others asking their own questions, pursuing their own systematic investigations, building on the foundations he laid. The notebooks document his particular journey, but the path itself remains open, inviting anyone with sufficient curiosity and persistence to walk it. Marked by the steady glow of electric light, no longer remarkable, no longer wondered at, simply assumed as the natural condition of evening, his presence persists. Not as ghost or spirit attempting communication through apparatus, but as legacy embedded in infrastructure, as method woven into culture, as example inspiring those who come after to ask their own questions and pursue their own systematic paths toward understanding. Where wonder and memory meet, gratitude lives, for the light that burns without flame, for the sound preserved beyond breath, for the motion captured and made eternal. For the systematic approach to mystery that refuses to accept ignorance as permanent condition. For the patient persistence that translates darkness into comprehension, one careful experiment at a time. It is said that to walk through a city at night, any city, anywhere that electric light has reached, is to walk through his legacy. Every illuminated window, every street lamp pushing back shadow. Every lit room where people live their ordinary lives, taking for granted the miracle that such simple gestures as flipping switches can summon obedient light from darkness. They do not think of him when they turn on lamps, do not remember the 1,000 failures that preceded success, the systematic testing of materials, the patient refinement of methods, the decades of work compressed into that casual gesture. The miracle has become mundane, the impossible has become infrastructure. And perhaps this forgetting is the truest measure of success. When technology becomes invisible, when it recedes into the background and is noticed only in absence, then it has truly arrived. Then it has become woven into the fabric of daily life so completely that its presence is assumed, its functioning taken for granted. The library of persistent light speaks to those who pause to listen, speaks through notebooks archived but available. through devices that still function or sit in museums as testament to innovation's history, through the grid that hums across continents, through the systematic approaches to problems that characterize modern research, through every question asked by minds that refuse to accept mystery as permanent. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. In the quiet accumulation of 3 million pages, in the patient testing of thousands of materials, in the systematic refinement of hypothesis through experiment, in the refusal to grant darkness the final word, the echo continues, soft but persistent, carrying forward the essential message that understanding is possible, that mystery yields to patient questioning, that the distance between impossible and inevitable is measured not in inspiration but in devoted, systematic, persistent work. Beneath the silence, wonder glows eternal. Not the wonder of the spectacular, but the deeper wonder of the reliable, the mundane miracle of light summoned by switches, of sound preserved in grooves, of motion captured in frames. The wonder that persists even after familiarity should have extinguished it, even after the impossible has become so ordinary that we forget it was ever impossible at all. Where the journey ends, new journeys begin. The notebooks document one man's systematic questioning of nature, but they also serve as invitation to anyone who reads them, to anyone who recognizes in their pages the method that translates mystery into understanding, impossibility into achievement, darkness into light. It is said that light persists longest in the dark, that the smallest flame becomes most precious when shadow threatens to overwhelm. That what he accomplished, what he and his collaborators and assistants and the entire apparatus of systematic innovation accomplished was to give humanity permanent flame. Light that does not gutter or fail, illumination as reliable as gravity, as assumed as air, the boy in the basement questioning chemicals, the young man at telegraph keys listening to silences, the inventor testing thousands of filaments, the aged botanist walking through experimental gardens, the questioner who refused to accept death's mystery as permanently closed. All the same person, all the same persistent wondering, all the same systematic devotion to understanding. And now the light burns on, patient, steady, eternal as anything human-made can be, glowing in windows, illuminating streets, pushing back the ancient darkness that once ruled every evening, that dictated human rhythms, that claimed the night as its own domain. No longer, the tyranny is broken. The darkness knows its master, and the master is us, we who flip switches without wonder, we who take for granted the miracle of light obeying will, we who inherit the fruits of patience and persistence and systematic questioning without having to pay the price in failures and refinements and decades of devoted work. Perhaps we should remember more often, should pause before switching on lamps and recognize what that gesture represents. Should honor the accumulated failures, the patient testing, the systematic devotion that made the impossible ordinary. But perhaps it is enough that the light burns, that the work continues, that the method persists, that somewhere always someone is asking questions in the spirit of that Michigan basement, of those telegraph silences, of those 1,000 failures before dawn. The library of persistent light needs no building to contain it. It exists wherever questions are asked, wherever systematic testing translates mystery into understanding, wherever persistence refuses to grant impossibility permanent authority, where memory fades at last into sleep, into dream, into the quiet darkness that comes when waking finally releases its hold there. In that gentle dimming of consciousness, perhaps we can hear it still. The patient hum of generators, the soft glow of filaments, the whisper of questions asked by minds that will not rest until they are answered. And in that whisper, wonder and gratitude merge, for the light, for the method, for the example, for the proof that darkness was never destiny, that ignorance is not permanent, that the impossible is merely the not yet accomplished, waiting for sufficient devotion to make it manifest. Rest now, let the light burn steady, let the questions echo softly, let wonder fold gently into sleep. The dreamer who lit the world has passed beyond, but the light remains, patient, eternal, waiting for us to notice it or not, burning either way, as it was meant to, as it always will. Where wonder lives, light follows, and in the following all darkness, even the darkness of forgetting, even the darkness of sleep, becomes less absolute, becomes softer, becomes bearable, becomes home. The journey ends, the light remains. And in the space between waking and dreaming, the echo of persistent questions carries us gently into night. Rest well.